In a few seconds, you will hear the rain sound. I know you're searching for a tiny bit of quiet in a world that never stops talking. You can close your eyes now. For a second, the dashcam caught two glowing amber eyes sitting deep in the roadside ditch. But as the headlights hit them directly, there was no body, just a lingering, tragic soul floating above the weeds. I can feel that spirit inside my car now, sharing their story and giving me goosebumps. But you are completely safe here. As I am hearing this rain while driving, no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. The modern world runs on a rapid-fire rhythm that keeps our brains frantic, but stories heal. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we begin, if these videos help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you left a like or subscribed or just wrote something small in the comments, even a single word. It helps other tired people find their way here too. Now, let us begin. Hey, come sit with me for a while. Whatever today cost you, you can put it down now, right here, for as long as you need. You have done enough. All I am asking of you tonight is that you let yourself be carried somewhere that is not your own life for a little while. This one is about the specific damage a tidy explanation can do, and it does not resolve the way you might want it to. So settle in and let it take its time. An explosion once leveled 800 square miles of forest and left almost nothing behind to explain itself. And the version of that story most people know now fits into a single, comfortable sentence. I have spent my career writing those sentences for a living. I have only recently begun to understand what gets quietly erased every time I make something incomprehensible sound clean. Good evening. I want to tell you about a forest in Siberia before I tell you about the report I am currently struggling to write. Because the forest taught me exactly how much a clean explanation can cost, long before I understood I was capable of costing someone the same thing myself. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, an explosion occurred over a remote, sparsely populated region of Siberia near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River, flattening an estimated 800 square miles of forest. Trees found afterward lying in a radial pattern, pointing outward from a central point, as though some enormous, invisible hand had pressed down on the landscape and pushed everything away from itself at once. Eyewitnesses dozens of miles away described a column of blue-white light brighter than the sun, followed by a heat so intense some felt their clothing scorch against their skin, and then a shock wave powerful enough to knock grown men off their feet and shatter windows in towns far beyond any reasonable blast radius anyone would have predicted in advance. The force of the explosion has since been estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons, well over 1,000 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. No confirmed meteorite fragments have ever been recovered from the site, despite multiple expeditions across the following century. The first proper scientific survey not even reaching the remote location until nearly 2 decades after the event itself, by which point the Taiga had already begun reclaiming much of the evidence. No crater exists. For several nights afterward, the skies over Europe and Asia remained unusually bright enough, according to contemporary accounts, to read a newspaper outdoors in London well after midnight. a detail modern atmospheric scientists still cannot fully explain to their own satisfaction. Every leading theory of the event, a stony asteroid disintegrating in the atmosphere, an icy comet fragment, some other mechanism entirely, has to account for the same stubborn absence, an explosion of almost unimaginable scale that left behind astonishingly little solid evidence of what actually caused it. I have thought about that specific gap more than almost anything else in my professional life. The distance between an event's true, undeniable scale and the thinness of what remains behind to explain it. A gap that has only grown more uncomfortable to sit with the longer I have done this work. I am a disaster investigator for a regional office covering central Oklahoma, working out of a low, unremarkable government building on the edge of town. The kind of office most residents never think about until the 1 week a year something unexplained happens, close enough to their own property to matter. The core function of my job, more than any single technical skill, is producing the public explanation that follows an unexplained atmospheric or ground event, a sonic phenomenon, an unusual explosion, a light or sound, witnessed by enough people to generate real, escalating public concern. My reports are written specifically to prevent panic and to starve conspiracy theories of the ambiguity they need to take root, which means they are, by design, simpler and more confident than the actual, messier body of evidence I usually have in front of me when I write them. I have become, over the years, genuinely skilled at that particular kind of confident simplification. Skilled enough that I rarely have to think consciously anymore about which details make it into a final report and which quietly do not. I want to tell you about the case that taught me exactly what that simplification can cost a real person. Before I tell you about the one currently sitting unfinished on my desk. 6 years ago, a loud, unexplained explosion occurred over a rural stretch of the county, startling residents awake before dawn, rattling windows, setting off a scattering of car alarms across 2 separate small towns. I remember arriving at the County Emergency Operations Center that morning to a phone line already lit up with calls. A level of public alarm I had not yet had to manage single-handedly at that early point in my career. My investigation, consistent with the available seismic and atmospheric data, concluded it was very likely a bolide, a small meteor fragmenting explosively in the upper atmosphere, a common and generally harmless phenomenon that occurs more often than most people realize. I wrote the report the way I write every report like it. Confident, technical, complete, designed to close the question cleanly enough that no local news outlet or online forum would have room left to speculate. One resident, a retired school teacher named Colette Farrow, who lived closest to the apparent epicenter, had reported something more specific than the other witnesses. A sustained, low, pulsing hum in the seconds before the explosion itself. A strange greenish quality to the light that briefly illuminated her bedroom. And a detail she offered almost apologetically, that her dog had refused to come out from under the bed for nearly 2 full days afterward. I remember interviewing her in her own kitchen, an elderly woman with a careful, precise way of speaking that struck me, even at the time, as more credible rather than less. The specific manner of someone determined to get every detail exactly right, rather than someone inventing color for effect. None of these details fit cleanly into the bold-eyed explanation, and I want to be honest about what I did with them. I did not include them in my report. I mentioned only the explosion itself, the timing, the seismic signature, the standard meteorological context. And I left her more specific, stranger observations out entirely, telling myself, at the time, that including unverifiable sensory details in an official document would only muddy an otherwise clean and useful explanation. The report was covered briefly by local media, framed exactly the way I had intended, tidy and reassuring. A single evening news segment and a short article in the county paper, both citing my office's conclusion as the final word on the matter. Colette Farrow, however, continued describing her fuller account publicly, at town meetings, in letters to the local paper, insisting that what she had experienced did not match the version everyone else now accepted as settled fact. I remember reading one of those letters myself, published several months after my report, in which she wrote, with a dignity I still find difficult to sit with, that she had not imagined what she had seen and heard, and that being told, indirectly but unmistakably, that her own experience did not count, unless it matched an official document, was its own kind of quiet cruelty. Because my official report did not include or corroborate any of her specific details, she was gradually, and I think genuinely without much cruelty intended on any single person's part, treated by her neighbors as an eccentric. Someone whose account had already been investigated and found wanting by trained professionals. I heard secondhand that she stopped attending the same church functions she had once been a regular fixture at, that a few of her closer friends began gently steering conversations away from the subject whenever she brought it up, a small, cumulative erosion of her own credibility that I had set in motion, with 3 flattened sentences I had not thought especially carefully about at the time. I remember running into her at a grocery store roughly a year later, and the particular guarded way she looked at me before quickly looking away, as though she had learned, by then, exactly how much weight my profession carried against her own direct experience. I did not fully understand what I had done to her until several years later, going back through my own case files for an unrelated review and rereading her original witness statement in full for the first time since I had first summarized it into 3 flattened sentences. I remember sitting alone in the records room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, my own handwritten interview notes spread out beside the typed report I had produced from them, and noticing, for the first time, how much of what she had actually said to me across nearly 90 minutes of careful, patient conversation had simply never made it onto the page at all. I sat with that statement for a long while, recognizing, with a specific sinking clarity, that I had not actually determined her more unusual observations were false. I had simply determined that they were inconvenient to the clean story I needed to tell, and I had chosen the clean story, and in doing so, had quietly handed an entire community permission to stop believing her. I looked up her contact information that same afternoon, sitting with my hand on the phone for a long while before finally deciding against calling, uncertain what an apology could possibly offer her beyond reopening a wound she may well have finally finished healing from on her own terms. I carried that unmade call with me for a long time afterward, telling myself more than once that I would make it eventually, once I found the right words, a justification I recognize now as its own quiet form of the same avoidance that had gotten me into this position in the first place. I want to tell you about the report I am currently failing to finish, because it has returned me to that same unresolved question with a force I did not expect to feel again this strongly. I called her 3 days ago, finally, after sitting with that old hesitation for longer than I probably needed to, dialing the number I had kept in an old file for years, without ever quite finding the courage to use it. Her voice on the line was older than I remembered, though still carrying the same careful, precise quality I recognized instantly from her kitchen 6 years before. I told her who I was, unsure whether she would even remember my name after everything, and there was a long pause on the line before she said, quietly, that of course she remembered. I told her, as plainly as I could manage, that I had gone back and reread her original statement, that I understood now how much I had left out of my report, and that I was sorry, fully and without qualification, for what that omission had cost her. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, long enough that I began to wonder if the call had dropped, and then she told me, in a voice steadier than I had any right to expect from her, that she had stopped needing anyone else to believe her a long time ago, that she knew what she had seen and heard, regardless of what any report ever said about it, but that she appreciated, more than I probably understood, finally hearing someone from my office say it out loud. Before we hung up, she asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether the new event I was investigating had any of the same qualities hers once had. And when I told her yes, she was quiet again, and then said only that she hoped this time I would let people believe what they had actually experienced. I do not know if that phone call undid anything. I know that I have not been able to stop thinking about the specific, hard-won steadiness in her voice, a strength she built entirely without my help, in the exact years my own silence made necessary. 3 weeks ago, a new unexplained event occurred over a different stretch of the county. A bright, prolonged flash, accompanied by a low, sustained tremor that registered on our regional seismic network but does not cleanly match the signature of any typical bolide event in our historical records. I have interviewed 11 witnesses so far, driving out to each household personally, rather than relying on phone statements the way I sometimes allow myself to when a case seems straightforward, and while most descriptions align reasonably well with an atmospheric explanation. 3 separate, unconnected residents have independently described a faint, sustained hum in the minutes beforehand, and 2 have mentioned animals in their households behaving with an agitation that lasted, in one case, for nearly 3 full days afterward. I have sat with each of these 3 witnesses longer than I strictly needed to for a standard interview, asking follow-up questions I would not ordinarily bother with, watching each of them offer their stranger details with the same faint, apologetic hesitation I remember from Colette Farrow's kitchen 6 years ago, as though some part of every witness who notices something outside the expected pattern already anticipates not being fully believed. One of the current witnesses, a young father named Marcus Dietrich, who lives with his wife and infant daughter on the eastern edge of the affected area, described the hum to me in more detail than any of the others. sitting at his own kitchen table with the baby monitor crackling faintly on the counter between us. He told me he had not mentioned it to his wife at first, worried she would think he was imagining things after a stressful week at work, and only brought it up to her once he learned, from a neighbor, that someone else nearby had reported something similar. I watched him relax slightly across the table once I told him I was taking his account seriously, a visible loosening in his shoulders that reminded me, uncomfortably, of exactly how much weight my simple attention seemed to carry for him. Weight I had not extended to Colette Farrow when she needed it most. I sat at my desk 2 nights ago with Colette Farrow's old file open beside my current draft report, a cup of coffee gone cold at my elbow, the office empty and quiet around me in the particular way government buildings go quiet after everyone else has gone home. Only the hum of the hallway vending machine, audible somewhere down the corridor. I stared at the same familiar temptation to smooth these inconvenient details into the margins, to write the report that closes the question cleanly, rather than the one that honestly represents the full, messier shape of what people actually told me. I felt something move through me in that moment that I recognize now as the specific accumulated weight of every report I have ever simplified before this one. A cold, wordless understanding that clarity and honesty, in this particular line of work, are not always the same accomplishment. I found myself sitting there, reaching for some small, solvable worry to hold, instead of the larger one in front of me, wondering whether I had submitted my mileage reimbursement for the week's interviews before the Friday deadline, a thought entirely unrelated to the report open on my screen, and I let myself sit inside it for several minutes before making myself return to the actual, unfinished document waiting there. I do not know, as I tell you this, what my final report will say. I know that Tunguska itself, the largest and most famous version of this exact category of event, has never actually been closed, that the version most people carry in their heads, a meteor exploded over Siberia, case understood, is a far more confident simplification than the genuine, still disputed scientific record actually supports. A gap between public certainty and scientific reality that I now recognize I have been quietly manufacturing myself, on a much smaller scale, for most of my career. I have read, over these past 3 weeks, more academic literature on that century-old case than I ever have before, drawn to it now with a personal urgency I did not feel when I first learned about it in school. Searching, I think, for permission of some kind, though I am still not entirely certain what I am hoping that permission will let me do. I have started to wonder whether every field that produces public explanations for the unexplained eventually develops the same quiet habit I have spent years practicing without fully examining it. Smoothing a genuinely strange, incompletely understood event into a story simple enough to stop people from asking further questions, and calling that smoothing resolution when it is very often something closer to a mercy killing of the truth's more difficult edges. I think about the scientists who spent decades searching that Siberian taiga for fragments that were never there to find, and I wonder whether some of them, too, eventually had to file a report acknowledging that the tidiest available answer was not actually the same thing as the true one, and whether that admission cost them anything close to what it is beginning to cost me. I still believe, fundamentally, in the value of what I do, that a community benefits from having a competent, evidence-based explanation, rather than being left to fill an information vacuum with fear and speculation. I have simply stopped being able to write that explanation without also asking myself who, exactly, is being asked to stay quiet so the explanation can stay clean. I have started drafting a version of this report that includes a clearly labeled section for unresolved witness observations, details that do not yet fit the leading explanation, but that were reported by credible, consistent sources, a format I have never used before, and one I suspect my supervisor will have real questions about when I submit it. I do not know if that format will survive the editing process above me, or whether it will simply be trimmed back down to the same clean, confident shape every report before it has taken. I intend to fight for it anyway, more than I have ever fought for a formatting choice in my career. I do not know yet what I will do with the 3 witnesses, whose accounts do not fit neatly into this report. I know only that I intend, this time, to include them fully, even if it means the report I file is less comforting, less complete sounding, and considerably harder for anyone reading it to simply set down and stop thinking about. I think often now of that Siberian forest, flattened in a single radial pattern outward from a point that never revealed what it actually was, and of how strange it feels to finally understand, after all these years of writing tidy endings for a living, that some of the most honest reports a person can write are the ones that refuse to fully close. The chair was still warm. I checked twice, because the first time I did not believe my own hand, and the second time I wanted it to be wrong. It was not wrong. Nobody had lived on that island in 6 years. The boat pulled away before I had even finished checking my gear, which was standard, because Kessler never lingered longer than the tide gave him. 6 hours, he called over the engine noise, already 30 feet out. Radio, if the panel's worse than they said. I am not coming back for you in the dark. I know how this works, Kessler. I know you know. I am saying it anyway. He lifted a hand, half wave, half warning, and then the boat swung its nose toward open water, and I was alone on 11 acres of granite with a dead automated light and a maintenance panel that had gone silent 2 days ago for no reason the mainland office could explain. The station had not held a living keeper since it was automated in the 90s. That was the whole point of my job. I went where nobody had to stay anymore, fixed what needed fixing, and left before the tide could argue with me about it. I had done this run 40-50 times. I knew the walk from the landing to the tower, the way I knew my own hallway at home. Gravel, then grass gone stiff with salt, then the 60 concrete steps up to the door. The door was unlocked. I stood there a second longer than I needed to, because the station was always locked, because I locked it myself the last time I left, 6 weeks ago, and because standing on a rock 11 miles from anyone with an unlocked door in front of you does something to the base of your spine that no amount of professional composure fully argues away. Hello? I said it out loud, to the door, to the empty station, because saying it felt more like procedure than fear. Nothing answered. Nothing was supposed to answer. I told myself that twice and pushed the door open. The kitchen was the first room past the entry. Small government issue. A single table bolted to the floor, from the days when this place still had crew. There was a plate on that table, eggs mostly eaten, a fork resting across the rim the way you rest a fork when you mean to come back to something in a minute. steam still curling off a mug of coffee beside it. I did not touch anything at first. I stood in the doorway with my tool bag still on my shoulder, running through every possible explanation my training had ever given me for a scene like this, and finding that none of them applied to a station with no assigned personnel, accessible only by boat, on a schedule only my own office controlled. "This is not possible," I said out loud again, because the sound of my own voice was doing more work than I wanted to admit. I checked the logbook on the wall, the automated one, the kind that records every door sensor trigger and power fluctuation for the mainland to review. The last logged entry was 6 weeks ago. My own visit, nothing since. I radioed the mainland office anyway, because that was procedure, because procedure was the only thing standing between me and the specific cold pressure building behind my sternum. "Station 4, this is Reyes. Radio check, static." I tried again. "Station 4 to base. Radio check. Come in." Nothing but the low, steady hiss of an open channel with no one on the other end. I checked the antenna mount myself, up on the landing outside, and found it intact, undamaged, exactly where it should be. The radio inside worked. I could hear the channel breathing. Nobody on the mainland end was answering it. I want to tell you about the second thing I found, because it is the thing I have not been able to stop turning over since. The chair at the kitchen table was overturned when I came back inside, though it had been upright, pushed neatly beneath the table, when I first walked past it not 10 minutes earlier. I stood very still in that doorway for a long moment, my own breath loud in my ears, and then I did the thing I am least proud of in this entire story. I reached out and put my hand flat against the seat of that chair. It was warm. Not cold from the room's own temperature, not the residual warmth of a heater somewhere nearby. Warm the way a chair is warm when someone has just gotten up out of it. I pulled my hand back so fast I knocked my own tool bag off my shoulder, and the clatter of it hitting the floor was, for 1 full second, the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. "Okay," I said to the empty kitchen, to nobody, my voice not sounding entirely like my own. "Okay. Think." Kessler was not due back for 6 hours. I had no boat. The nearest station with a working radio relay was on the mainland, 11 miles of open water. I had no way of crossing on my own. Whatever was happening on this rock, I was going to be inside it for the rest of the daylight at minimum, and I did not yet know how much of the dark besides. I checked every room. That is the part of this I want you to understand clearly, because it matters for what came after. I did not simply retreat to a corner and wait out the clock. I am trained for exactly this kind of uncertainty, and I made myself walk the station the way I would walk any site, with an unexplained anomaly, methodical, room by room, cataloging rather than fleeing. The bunk room held 3 beds, though the station had been automated for 6 years and required, on paper, no living crew at all. 2 of the beds were made with a precision that read as recent hospital corners, blankets pulled taut. The third was unmade, sheets thrown back the way you throw back sheets when you get up in a hurry, rather than waking slowly. I found, on the small shelf above that third bed, a single photograph, curling slightly at the edges, of a man I did not recognize standing in front of this exact station, younger, in a uniform style the Coast Guard had not issued since before I was born. I photographed everything: log times, radio silence, warm chair, unmade bed, uniform decades out of service. I kept working, kept moving, kept my hands steady through sheer, deliberate insistence, because I understood, somewhere underneath the fear, that stopping to feel any of it fully was a luxury I could not afford until Kessler's boat was back in sight. It was in the equipment room, checking the actual fault that had brought me out here in the first place, that I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from directly above me from the lamp room, a space accessible only by a single spiral staircase I had climbed past 20 minutes earlier, finding it locked and undisturbed exactly as it should have been. I did not call out this time. I want you to understand that clearly, because it is the only choice in this entire story I still believe, without any hesitation, that I got right. I stood very still at the base of that staircase, one hand on the cold iron railing, and I listened to the footsteps cross the lamp room floor above me, unhurried, patient, the pace of someone with nowhere else in the world they needed to be. They stopped directly above the trap door. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs had gone stiff by the time I finally made myself move, backing away from the staircase, one careful step at a time, my eyes never leaving the trapdoor above me, even as I retreated toward the kitchen, toward the radio, toward anything that still resembled a working connection to a world outside this rock. The radio was still open, still hissing, still empty on the other end. Base, this is Reyes. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and I have thought since that the steadiness itself frightened me more than losing it would have. Some old, well-trained part of me performing calm long after the rest of me had stopped feeling any. I need an early pickup. Station 4, I need an early pickup. Static answered. Only static. I do not know exactly when the footsteps started again. Only that at some point, sitting at that radio with the channel open and useless in front of me, I became aware of them moving through the station below the lamp room now, room to room, unhurried, the specific weight of a full-grown man's stride on old wooden floorboards, and I understood, with a cold, total certainty, that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with something older in my body than my training had ever reached. That whoever it was not lost, and was not afraid, and knew this station considerably better than I did. I went to the kitchen window and looked out at open water in every direction, gray and empty, and 11 miles from anyone who could reach me before dark. The footsteps stopped outside the kitchen door. I do not know how long I stood there, on the other side of that door, listening to a silence that felt, somehow, more occupied than the footsteps had been. I did not open it. I want you to hold on to that, because it is the only thing I have to offer you as an ending that resembles courage rather than simple, frozen luck. Kessler's boat came back 4 hours early, close to dusk, because the mainland office had finally noticed the dead radio channel and grown worried enough to send him early without waiting for my scheduled window. I do not remember most of the walk down to the landing. I remember the door of the station standing open behind me when I finally allowed myself to look back, though I know, with absolute certainty, that I closed it. I have not told the office everything that happened on that rock. I have told them about the dead radio, the anomalous logbook gap, the fault in the panel that turned out in the end to be nothing more than a corroded relay, an entirely ordinary explanation for why the light had gone dark 2 days earlier. I have not told them about the warm chair, or the unmade bed, or the photograph of a man in a uniform the Coast Guard retired before I was born. I looked him up anyway, 3 nights later, unable to sleep, scrolling through old service records until I found a name that matched a face I had only seen once, curling at the edges, on a shelf above a bed that should not have been slept in for 6 years. He served on that exact station in the 1960s. His file lists him as lost at sea during a routine maintenance call, alone in weather the report describes, with a kind of bureaucratic understatement I have come to recognize now as its own particular horror, as unremarkable for the season. I go back to that station next month. It is on the schedule, the same rotation it has always been on, and nobody at the office has offered to send someone with me, because nobody at the office knows there is any reason they should. I keep thinking about the chair, not the warmth of it, though I think about that too. I keep thinking about the fact that it was upright when I walked past it and overturned less than 10 minutes later, in a locked station with no door I had not personally watched the entire time, and I keep thinking about how certain I was, standing in that kitchen with my hands still tingling from the warmth of it, that whoever had been sitting there had simply, quietly, stood up the moment I stopped looking. A family once kept a billboard standing beside a highway for decades. Photographs of 5 missing children weathering slowly under the sun, because the official conclusion about what happened to them never once matched what the parents knew in their own bodies to be true. I have spent my career writing the kind of conclusion that family refused to accept, confident and final and complete on paper, in a way that real evidence rarely actually earns. I no longer write it as easily as I once did. Good evening. I want to tell you about a billboard beside a highway in West Virginia before I tell you about the fire currently sitting open on my desk, because the billboard is the reason I have never again been able to write a conclusion without asking myself first whether I have genuinely earned it. On Christmas Eve of 1945, a house fire destroyed the home of the Sauter family in Fayetteville, West Virginia. A blaze that consumed the structure so completely that firefighters, delayed by a chain of unexplained obstacles, could do little more than watch it burn to the ground. The fire department itself was not reached until well after the blaze had already taken firm hold. The family's own attempts to call for help thwarted before they had even fully understood what was happening inside their home. 5 of the family's 10 children were never found afterward. The official investigation concluded that they had died in the fire, their remains presumably consumed entirely by the flames. A conclusion the family never accepted, not for a single day of the more than 40 years the parents spent afterward trying to prove otherwise. Phone lines to the house, which should have allowed an early call for help, were found cut, not burned through as fire damage would typically produce, but severed cleanly, in a manner investigators at the time noted without ever fully explaining. A ladder normally kept against the side of the house was discovered, relocated a considerable distance away, in a spot that made no practical sense, unless someone had deliberately moved it to delay anyone climbing to a second-story window where several of the children slept. The family's car, in working order only days before, would not start that night. despite no mechanical explanation ever being found for the failure, a detail that struck even the most skeptical later investigators as difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. A stranger had visited the property weeks earlier, warning, unprompted, that the home's wiring would eventually cause a fire. A detail the family only fully understood the weight of after the fact. A witness later reported seeing a girl resembling one of the missing children on a passing bus the following morning, dressed, notably, in clothing that did not match anything reported lost in the fire, staring back at the witness through the window, with an expression the woman later described as frightened rather than simply curious. The Stoddard parents spent the rest of their lives refusing the closure the official investigation had handed them. The Sodder parents spent the rest of their lives refusing the closure the official investigation had handed them, erecting a large billboard along a nearby highway bearing photographs of their 5 missing children and a standing reward for information. A billboard that remained standing, weathering slowly under decades of sun and rain, until well after both parents had themselves died, still waiting for an answer that never came. I have seen photographs of that billboard reproduced many times since I first learned about the case in my early training. The children's faces rendered increasingly faint with each passing decade of exposure, and I have always found something almost unbearable in that specific, visible fading. An entire family's refusal to accept an ending, slowly losing even its own physical clarity, while the refusal itself somehow never once wavered. I have thought about that billboard more than almost anything else in my professional life. The specific, unbearable position of a family being told, with official confidence, that their children had died in a way that left literally nothing behind to bury, and being expected to accept that confidence over their own unprovable certainty that something else had actually happened. I have thought about that specific gap more than almost anything else in my professional life. The distance between what a fire actually proves and what a family needs it to have proven, a distance that has only grown more uncomfortable to sit inside the longer I have done this work. I am a fire investigator for a regional office in rural Ohio, working out of a small building that shares space with the county sheriff's department, spending a considerable portion of most winters driving between burned-out structures in the particular bone-deal cold that always seems to follow the worst house fires in this part of the country. The central function of my job, more than any single technical skill, is producing a clear, defensible conclusion about cause and casualties following a residential fire, a conclusion families depend on for insurance claims, foreclosure, for the simple, brutal necessity of being able to plan a funeral, or, in the rarer and more agonizing cases, decide there is no body left to bury at all. My training has always emphasized delivering that conclusion with confidence, because a hedged, uncertain finding serves almost no one well, prolongs grief without purpose, and leaves families in exactly the kind of unresolved suspension the Sodders spent 40 years trapped inside. I want to tell you about the case that taught me how dangerous that confidence can be. Before I tell you about the one currently testing it again, because I do not think you can understand what I am carrying into that office 3 days from now without first understanding exactly what I once carried out of it. 7 years ago, early in my career, I investigated a house fire in a rural township that claimed the life of a family's youngest child, a 5-year-old boy whose bedroom was closest to the point of origin. I remember arriving at that scene before dawn, the structure still smoking in places, firefighters coiling hoses in the gray, exhausted light of a night that had clearly gone on far longer than any of them had expected. The fire had burned hot and fast, and by the time investigators were able to safely enter the structure, remains consistent with a child of his approximate size and age were recovered from the collapsed area of his bedroom. I wrote my report accordingly, listing the fire as the confirmed cause of his death, a conclusion that allowed the family to hold a funeral, to begin, as much as any family can, the actual work of grieving rather than remaining suspended in uncertainty. I remember feeling, at the time, a genuine sense of having done my job well, having given a devastated family the one thing I believed they needed most, a clear and complete answer. 2 years later, a woman contacted our office directly, identifying herself as a distant relative of the child's biological father, a man who had lost custody rights years before the fire, and had not been in contact with the family since. I remember taking that call myself, sitting at my desk on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, and I remember the particular way my chest tightened the moment she said the boy's name, a name I had not thought about in months, and had assumed wrongly I would never need to think about again in this specific way, she told us, hesitantly, and with real fear in her voice, that she had reason to believe the boy might still be alive, living under a different name in another state, taken by his biological father sometime in the confusion of that same night, a possibility she had only recently come to suspect after a strange, unverified sighting at a family gathering she had not personally attended, a photograph a cousin had shared, showing a young boy who bore an unsettling resemblance to school photos of the child everyone believed had died years earlier. I want to be honest that our subsequent investigation was, by that point, 7 years too late to produce anything conclusive. The biological father had died 3 years earlier, in a state 2,000 miles from where the fire had occurred. Any child he may have taken with him would by then have been raised entirely inside a new identity for the better part of a decade, in a home we were never able to definitively locate. The photograph itself, too grainy and too many degrees removed from a verifiable source to serve as anything more than an unresolved, haunting possibility, rather than actual evidence. I do not know, to this day, whether that boy died in the fire I once confidently attributed to him, or whether the remains recovered from his bedroom belonged to someone else entirely. A detailed forensic technology available at the time was simply not equipped to rule out with the certainty I had implied in my original report. I know only that a family closed a chapter of grief based on my conclusion, buried a small casket, moved forward with their lives, and that if the woman who contacted us years later was right about even part of what she believed, that closure came at a cost none of them ever consented to or understood they were paying. I want to tell you about the fire currently sitting open on my desk, because it has returned me to that same unresolved question with a force I did not expect to feel again this strongly, closer to home this time than any case I have handled since. 5 weeks ago, a house fire in a small rural community within my jurisdiction claimed what investigators initially assumed to be the life of a teenage girl whose bedroom, much like the case 7 years earlier, sat closest to the fire's point of origin. I remember arriving at that scene and feeling, before I had even stepped out of my car, an uncomfortable, immediate resonance with the earlier case. The same time of year, the same general layout of the house, the same devastated quiet among the first responders standing at the property's edge. The blaze burned hot enough, and long enough before firefighters arrived, that the remains recovered from that section of the house are fragmentary, insufficient, according to our forensic pathologist, for a confident identification without DNA analysis, still pending from an overwhelmed state lab, a delay I have been tracking with a kind of anxious attention I do not usually bring to lab turnaround times. In the 5 weeks since, 3 separate details have emerged that I have not yet been able to reconcile with a straightforward accidental fire. A phone line found severed at a point that predates the fire's spread to that part of the house. A spare key, normally kept in a lockbox near the back door, found missing entirely. Its small metal door hanging open on a single remaining hinge. And a neighbor's account of an unfamiliar car parked near the property for several nights in the week before the fire. Gone by morning each time. Details I have cross-referenced against the original solder case notes. More times than I probably should admit to anyone in my own department. I reached out to that first family last month. For the first time since the investigation into the relative's claim, quietly closed without resolution 5 years ago. I want to be honest about why this new case had unsettled something in me that I could not simply set aside, and I found myself needing, almost desperately, to know how they had carried the not knowing in the years since, whether it had gotten easier, whether there was some version of peace available to a family in their position that I could eventually point the current mother toward, if this case ended the same unresolved way theirs had. A comparison I recognize now was probably unfair to both families, but one I could not stop myself from making anyway. The mother answered when I called, her voice careful, and a little surprised to hear from me after so long, as though some part of her had assumed our office had simply forgotten her family's file the moment it stopped being an active case. She told me, honestly, that she had made a kind of peace with it, though she was careful to specify that the peace had nothing to do with certainty, that she had simply, eventually, run out of the particular energy grief like that demands, and had to find a way to keep living inside the question, rather than waiting for it to be answered, before she allowed herself to continue. She asked me, near the end of our call, whether I had ever found out anything more, and I told her no, and she was quiet for a moment before telling me, gently, that she hoped I would not let this new case cost me as much as her own case clearly still had, all these years later. I did not have a good response for her in the moment, only a quiet thank you, and a promise to call again if anything changed. I am not certain I have found a better response since, though I have thought about her question more times over these past weeks than I have thought about almost anything else. The girl's mother has asked me, directly and repeatedly, for a conclusion, understandably desperate for something solid enough to hold on to, rather than the shifting, unbearable uncertainty she has been living inside for 5 weeks now. I sat across from her in my office 3 days ago, a box of tissues between us that neither of us had touched, and I watched her hands, folded tightly in her lap, twist a small piece of paper into an increasingly ragged shape over the course of our conversation. A nervous, unconscious motion she seemed entirely unaware of performing. She told me near the end of that meeting that she simply needed to know whether to keep hoping or to finally allow herself to grieve. That living inside both possibilities at once had become, in her own words, more than she could continue to carry much longer. I felt the old, familiar pull toward the kind of confident language that would give her something to finally exhale around, a completed sentence rather than an open one. I did not give it to her. I want to be honest that this choice has not brought her any comfort at all, and that I watched something in her expression close off slightly when I explained, as gently as I could manage, that the physical evidence genuinely did not yet support a confident conclusion either direction. I am not certain even now whether withholding that false comfort was actually the more honest kindness, or simply my own inability to risk being wrong in the specific, devastating way I once was 7 years ago. I sat in my car in the office parking lot after that meeting, engine off, a cup of coffee gone cold in the cup holder, the late afternoon light already thinning toward evening in the particular, early way it does in Ohio winters. I found myself reaching for a small, solvable worry to hold instead of the larger one still sitting in my chest, wondering whether I had submitted the lab request paperwork correctly before the courier picked it up that afternoon. A thought entirely unrelated to the mother's face across my desk only minutes earlier, and I let myself sit inside it for several minutes longer than it actually deserved, watching my own breath fog faintly against the cold windshield in the dimming light. I do not know, as I tell you this, what the DNA results will eventually show, or whether they will arrive in time to matter to a mother who is currently making funeral arrangements out of sheer, unbearable necessity, regardless of what remains unconfirmed. I have offered to help her hold the arrangements in a kind of suspended readiness, rather than finalizing them completely. A compromise she accepted with visible relief, though I understand it only extends her uncertainty rather than resolving it. A trade, she told me plainly, she would rather make than close the question falsely, the way I once helped close it for another family. I think often now about the Sauter family's billboard, about two parents who spent 40 years refusing an official conclusion the world had already accepted on their behalf, standing beside a highway with photographs slowly fading in the weather, refusing to let an entire community's comfortable closure become their own. I have started to understand that billboard differently than I once did, not as a refusal of grief, but as its own kind of honesty, a public, permanent refusal to pretend a question was answered simply because an answer would have been easier to live with. I wonder sometimes whether my own profession's discomfort with that kind of visible, ongoing uncertainty says more about what we need from our own work than about what the families we serve actually need from us. I still believe fundamentally in the value of what I do, that most families genuinely need and deserve a clear, confident conclusion, rather than being left indefinitely inside the kind of suspended not knowing that consumed the Sodders for the rest of their lives. I have simply stopped being able to produce that confidence without first asking myself, privately and rigorously, whether I have actually earned it, or whether I am simply offering a grieving family the version of an ending that is easiest for all of us to accept. I have started keeping a second, private log alongside my official case files now, a running account of every conclusion I have delivered, and the specific evidence, or lack of it, that actually supported each one. A habit born entirely out of the fear that I might otherwise let myself forget, case after case, exactly how much certainty I am truly entitled to claim. I do not know what I will tell this mother when the DNA results finally arrive. I know only that I intend to tell her the truth, however incomplete it turns out to be, rather than the version of the truth that would let either of us stop thinking about this sooner. Some nights, driving home past the turnoff for the highway where I once, years ago on a work trip, saw a photograph of that old West Virginia billboard reproduced in a magazine article about unsolved cases. I find myself wondering whether the Sodders, in their own way, understood something about this work, long before I ever did. That a question left honestly open is sometimes a truer gift to the people living inside it than any answer a person is not yet actually entitled to give. I still have the paper. I keep it in a drawer I do not open anymore, in an envelope I have never labeled, and some nights I take it out just to look at the handwriting. 'Cause even now, after everything, some small, stupid part of me still believes I could read it correctly if I just tried once more. Settle in. This one moves slowly, the way real fear usually does. Less like a door slamming, and more like a room getting a little colder than you noticed at first. Nobody in this story raises their voice. That is not what it needs. My work has always been about believing what the hand shows you, and disbelieving everything else. 22 years of examining loops and pressure, and the small tremors people leave in ink without meaning to. And in that time I built a reputation for a kind of certainty most people in my field do not claim. The certainty that if you look closely enough, a person cannot lie to you in their own handwriting, even when they are trying. I still believe that. Mostly. It is the mostly that I have had to learn to live inside. I was hired by the Whitcomb family through their attorney, a woman named Marguerite Soul, who had used me twice before, and trusted my read the way some people trust a doctor, completely and a little too easily. The Whitcombs had bought an old colonial on Orchard Hollow Road in Aldermere, a town so small it did not have a stoplight, only a four-way stop everyone treated as a suggestion. Within a week of moving their boxes in, before the paint had even dried in the nursery, the letters began arriving. Not threats, not exactly. Something stranger. The first one told them which room the baby would sleep in, though they had not chosen yet. And it was right. The letter was signed only with a phrase, the same phrase that would end every letter after it. I am the one who keeps this house. Local legend Marguerite told me on the phone, apologetic, as though warning me the case might sound foolish. Aldermere had an old story about keeping letters, families who wrote to new owners for generations, watching over houses the way some towns still leave a light on for strangers. Most people treated it as folklore, harmless, even sentimental. But the tone of these letters was not sentimental. I read the first one twice before I said anything, and what I noticed before the content, before any of it, was the paper. It was cream-laid stock, heavy, with a faint chain-line texture you only find in paper made the old way, on a mold, not a machine. Beautiful stuff, expensive or old, or both. I made a note of it the way I make a note of everything. A professional appreciation more than a suspicion, and told myself someone with taste like that was probably harmless, an eccentric with a fountain pen and too much time. I want you to remember that I thought that. I want you to remember how sure I was. By the second week, I had told the Whitcombs and told the local police and told Marguerite that the handwriting showed no capacity for violence. I stood by that. The strokes were even, unhurried, the pressure consistent from the first word to the last. None of the erratic spiking you look for in a hand under real emotional strain. Whoever was writing these letters was calm. I said calm meant safe, and everyone in that conference room wanted very badly to believe me, and I let them. I have thought about that room more times than I can count. For a while, it seemed I was right. 2 weeks passed without a letter, and the Whitcombs began to unpack the last of their boxes, and I remember sitting in their kitchen while Sarah Whitcomb made coffee that went cold before either of us touched it. Steam curling up off 2 mugs neither of us needed. And for the length of that quiet, ordinary morning, I let myself believe the whole thing was already over. That is the part I miss most now, oddly. Not the danger. The morning before I understood there still was any. Then the third letter came, and it was not for the Whitcombs. It came to my office, addressed to me by name, in the same even hand, on the same cream-laid paper with the same faint chain-line texture running through it like a watermark. And the moment I opened the envelope, something in my chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with the fact that no one outside my firm had this address. The letter was short. It told me I read hands beautifully, but that reading was not the same as understanding, and that I would learn the difference before the year was out. It did not threaten me. It complimented me, which was worse, because I had spent 2 decades believing threats were the thing to fear, and here was proof that a compliment could carry the same weight if it came from the right hand. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my own desk with both letters spread in front of me, the one to the Whitcombs and the one to me, running comparisons the way I would for any case, stroke width, baseline drift, the particular slant of the lowercase e, and every measurement told me the same person had written both, which I already knew, and told me nothing about who that person was, which was the only thing that mattered. My hands, when I finally noticed them, were not entirely steady. I told myself it was the coffee. I had not had coffee since noon. Something small and stubborn in me still wanted this to be about the Whitcombs' house, not about me, so I drove back to Aldermere the next morning and asked to walk the property alone. Sarah let me in without asking why, which I was grateful for, because I did not have an answer that would have made sense out loud. The house smelled like cedar and old plaster, and faintly underneath that, like wood smoke, though no fire had been lit in it for months. I stood in the front hall a long time, looking at nothing in particular, and I noticed that the floorboards near the door had been walked so many times over so many decades that the finish had worn away in a path, narrow, direct, leading from the door straight to the base of the staircase, as though whoever had walked it never once wandered. I went home that evening and, out of habit more than suspicion, pulled my old paper archive, the box of stock samples I kept from years of teaching seminars on materials analysis. I wanted to identify the mill, narrow the source, something concrete to hand back to the police, instead of my own fraying nerves. Near the bottom of the box, beneath samples I had not touched in a decade, I found a small stack of the exact cream-laid paper, chain line and all, the twin of the paper in both letters, sitting in the file beside it. I remember laughing, actually laughing, a short, unpleasant sound in an empty apartment. Because of course I had this paper. I had bought 3 reams of it years ago for a seminar on identifying handmade stock, and I had given sample sheets to every student in that class, a dozen people, maybe more, and any one of them could have kept a few sheets. And any one of them could be anyone by now. I told myself that was the explanation. It was almost a relief, actually, to have an explanation, even an unsettling one, and I filed the coincidence under things I would look into later, and I went to bed, and for a while I even slept. It was around then that I started doing something I had not done since I was young in this work. Whenever the thought of that seminar room rose up in me, faces I could not fully picture anymore, I would find myself straightening the index cards on my desk, squaring their corners, over and over, until the small motion of my hands crowded out whatever else was trying to surface. I told myself I was simply organizing my files. I had been telling myself that for 3 nights running. I was getting better at believing it. The letters kept coming to both addresses, mine and the Whitcombs, for another month, and each one grew slightly more familiar, in a way that made my skin prickle before my mind caught up to why. One mentioned offhand the specific brand of tea I kept on my kitchen counter. Another referenced, without naming it, a case I had testified on 11 years earlier, one I had never discussed publicly, one whose file had been sealed. My scalp went tight reading that line, a small, cold, crawling sensation I could not blame on the weather, because the room I was sitting in was warm. That case was the Bellamy case, and I had not let myself think its name in years. I had been young then, 4 years into practice, hired to assess a set of anonymous letters sent to a family whose teenage daughter, Callie Bellamy, had begun receiving them at school. I remember the confidence I had, standing in front of her parents, telling them the handwriting showed restraint, control, no capacity for violence. The same words I would use again, decades later, in the Whitcombs' kitchen, as though I had learned nothing at all in the years between. Callie disappeared 4 months after I gave that assessment. She was found, eventually, and the person responsible was never identified, and the case went cold, and I told myself for years that my analysis had been correct as far as it went, that reading a hand tells you what a person is capable of on the page, not what they might become given time and permission. I have never fully believed that excuse. I built an entire second decade of my career trying to prove it to myself anyway, one careful analysis at a time, as though enough correct answers could retroactively make the first one true. The letters that Autumn kept circling closer to that old wound, gently, almost tenderly, the way a hand might circle a bruise it already knows is there. I stopped sleeping properly. I stopped answering calls from numbers I did not recognize. And then, on a Tuesday in late October, a letter arrived that made my vision narrow at the edges before I had finished the first line, my hands trembling in a way I could not still no matter how tightly I gripped the paper. It thanked me, by name, for what I had taught it about reading people. It said my seminar had changed how it understood the world, That watching for the small tremors people leave in ink without meaning to had become its favorite thing to do, that it had been practicing for 11 years, ever since a classroom in a building that no longer exists. It signed off, as always, "I am the one who keeps this house." But beneath the signature, for the first time, it had written a second line, "Not the Whitcombs' house. Yours." I do not remember deciding to leave my apartment that night. I remember standing at my own front door with my car keys already in my hand, coat half on, no memory of crossing the room to get them. And that gap, that missing minute where my body had clearly acted before my mind agreed to it, frightened me more than anything the letters had said outright. I drove to Aldermere without a plan, only the old instinct that if I could stand in that house one more time, if I could look closely enough at everything in it, I would finally read it correctly. Sarah Whitcomb let me in again, worried by my face more than my explanation, and I walked straight to the worn path in the floorboards, the one leading from the front door to the base of the staircase, and I knelt down the way I would kneel over any piece of evidence, running my fingers along the grain, and beneath the newest layer of finish, pressed faintly into the wood, the way something is pressed in only after years of the exact same weight returning to the exact same spot. I found initials, small, old, carved by someone who had stood at that door many, many times, long before the Whitcombs ever saw the listing. They were not strangers' initials. They matched, letter for letter, a name from my old seminar roster, a name I had not let myself think in 11 years, because thinking it meant admitting I had once sat across from this exact person in a classroom and taught them, patiently, generously, everything I knew about how a hand reveals what a person is trying to hide. I had praised their attention to detail. I remembered praising it specifically. I never saw them. Not once, not that night or any night after. I gave the police what I had, the paper, the initials, the 11-year thread connecting a sealed case to a seminar room to a colonial house on Orchard Hollow Road, and they opened a file that, as far as I know, is still open, unresolved, the way the Bellamy case is still unresolved, the way certain doors in certain old houses never quite finish closing all the way. The Whitcombs sold the house within the year. I do not blame them. I left the profession not long after. People assume it was fear, and it was, some of it. But that was not the whole of it. The whole of it is harder to say out loud even now. For 22 years I built my entire sense of safety on the belief that if I looked closely enough at a person's hand, I would know them completely, and that knowing would be enough to protect the people who trusted me to look. I taught that belief to a room full of strangers once, freely, generously, because I thought certainty like mine could only do good in the world. I never once asked what it might do in the wrong hand, because I did not think a hand could be wrong if it had been trained by mine. I still have the paper. I keep it in a drawer I do not open anymore, in an envelope I have never labeled, and some nights I take it out just to look at the handwriting, because even now, after everything, some small stupid part of me still believes I could read it correctly if I just tried once more. I know better now. I know a hand can show you everything true about a person, and still not show you what they are willing to become. And I know that the surest thing I ever taught anyone was not how to read people at all. It was how to be read completely, by someone who had already decided exactly what to do with everything I gave them. Above a certain altitude, the dead stop being tragedies and start being landmarks. I have told every client I have ever guided that they may someday have to walk past a dying person to survive, and that this will be the correct decision, even though it will never once feel like one. I believed that completely, until the year I had to decide it for myself, standing in wind loud enough to make shouting necessary, with a stranger's face turned toward mine, and no good option waiting on either side of the choice. Good evening. I want to tell you about a mountain. Before I tell you about the decision I made, partway up it, because you will need to understand the mountain's particular arithmetic first, the one that makes an otherwise unthinkable choice into something closer to simple math, the kind of math that does not care, in the moment how much a person wishes it worked differently. Before I tell you about the decision I made partway up it, because you will need to understand the mountain's particular arithmetic first, the one that makes an otherwise unthinkable choice into something closer to simple math, the kind of math that does not care, in the moment, how much a person wishes it worked differently. Above roughly 8,000 meters of elevation, on the world's highest peaks, the human body begins actively dying, regardless of what a climber does to stop it. A stretch of altitude experienced climbers have long called the death zone. The air holds so little oxygen that the body cannot acclimatize to it under any circumstances, only endure it for a limited window before cognition, judgment, and basic physical function all begin to fail in ways no amount of training can fully prevent. Climbers in that zone burn through their own body's reserves at a rate no food or rest can adequately replace, which is part of why expedition windows above that altitude are measured in hours rather than days, a narrow, unforgiving margin that every decision made up there has to respect. Rescue in that zone is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not survivable to attempt. A climber who stops to help someone who is dying in the death zone is very often choosing to die alongside them, and this is not a dramatic exaggeration meant to frighten new clients. It is a documented statistical reality repeated across decades of expedition records, cited in medical journals studying high-altitude physiology, and in the sobering internal debriefs every serious expedition company conducts after a season with fatalities. More than 200 bodies remain, permanently, on the world's highest mountains, left where they fell because no safe method of recovery has ever existed for that altitude, some of them so well known along established routes that climbers use them, plainly and without any remaining sense of the horror in it, as navigational landmarks, a specific coat color or resting position, noted matter-of-factly in route briefings, the way you might note a distinctive boulder or a bend in a trail. I have built my entire professional life around preparing climbers for the specific moment when this arithmetic might apply to them directly. I am a high-altitude expedition guide, working out of a training facility in the Cascades where clients spend weeks building the physical and mental conditioning a serious international ascent requires. And one of the most important things I do, long before any client ever sets foot above the death zone, is sit with them in a quiet room and tell them, as plainly as I can, that they may someday face a choice between continuing to survive and stopping to help someone who cannot be saved without costing them their own life as well. I have given that briefing more times than I can count, in the same small room with the same folding chairs. Watching the specific way each client's face changes as the reality of it settles in for the first time. Some nodding immediately, as though they had already privately anticipated hearing it, others needing several long minutes of silence before they can respond at all. I tell them that the correct choice, in that specific and narrow circumstance, is almost always to keep moving, and that this will not feel correct in any way that matters to the part of them making the decision. I have said some version of this to every client I have ever guided, and I have believed it completely, because it is true, because the alternative, encouraging well-meaning rescue attempts that cost 2 lives instead of 1, would be a far greater harm dressed up as compassion. I used to believe, delivering that briefing, that understanding the logic of it in advance would be enough to carry a person through the moment itself, should it ever actually arrive. I no longer believe that, quite so simply. I want to tell you about the ascent that tested whether I actually believed what I had spent years teaching, rather than simply repeating it convincingly. 4 years ago, I was guiding a small expedition on an 8,000-meter peak in the Himalayas, a mountain I will not name specifically, out of respect for the people involved in what happened and their families since. My client that season was a disciplined, careful climber I had worked with over 2 prior, smaller expeditions, someone whose judgment I trusted enough to bring on an ascent this serious, and we had spent the better part of 6 weeks acclimatizing before our summit window finally opened. On our summit push, in conditions already deteriorating faster than the forecast had predicted, wind picking up steadily enough that I had begun quietly recalculating our own safe margin every 20 minutes. We came across a climber from an entirely separate expedition, seated upright against a rock outcropping just inside the upper edge of the death zone, alive, conscious, unable to stand under his own power, his oxygen supply already exhausted. I did not know him personally. I knew, within the first minute of assessing his condition, everything my training had spent years preparing me to recognize, that carrying him down myself would cost both of us our lives in conditions already narrowing our own safe window to almost nothing, that his own expedition, strung out somewhere below us on the route, was too far away to reach him in time even if radioed immediately, and that the only choice available to me, that preserved my own client's life and mine, was to continue upward and report his position on our way back down, exactly as every piece of training I have ever given someone else instructs them to do. I remember the wind tearing at both our jackets while I crouched there, loud enough that I had to lean close, just to hear my own thoughts clearly. And I remember crouching beside him for perhaps 90 seconds, no longer, checking his oxygen supply myself to confirm what I already suspected. And I remember the specific, level way he looked back at me while I did it, neither pleading nor panicked, simply present, as though some part of him had already run the same arithmetic I was running and arrived, independently, at the same conclusion. I made that choice. I want to be plain about that. because softening it would dishonor what it actually cost. I radioed his position, gave the coordinates as precisely as the conditions allowed, relayed his condition to the base camp operator in a voice I remember keeping deliberately flat and professional, and continued the ascent with my own client, the two of us moving upward past a man who was, as far as either of us could tell in that moment, still entirely aware of what was happening to him. My client did not speak for the next hour of climbing, neither did I. He was gone by the time a rescue attempt reached that location the following day. Though I want to be honest that no one ever truly mounted a rescue attempt in the sense that word usually implies. Only a recovery, a distinction that took me a long time to stop flinching at whenever I encountered it in the official expedition report afterward, printed there in the same flat administrative language used for equipment failures and weather delays. I do not know how long after we passed him he remained conscious, and I have never let myself search for information that would answer that question more precisely than I already understand it, because I do not believe a more precise answer would actually change anything about the decision itself. We reached the summit roughly 3 hours later, in conditions that had continued to worsen exactly as I had feared, and I remember almost nothing about that moment that most climbers describe as the defining achievement of their careers. No clear memory of the view, no distinct recollection of my client's reaction, only the flat, mechanical awareness of checking our remaining oxygen and calculating our descent window. The same cold arithmetic that had governed the last 3 hours, simply continuing to govern the next several. We passed the same outcropping on our way back down less than 2 hours later. He was no longer conscious by then, or if he was, he no longer responded to either of our voices, and I remember crouching beside him again briefly, confirming what I already understood, before continuing down alongside my client in a silence that lasted the rest of that descent, and in some ways has never fully lifted since. I want to tell you about the debrief that followed at base camp, because it has stayed with me nearly as vividly as the decision itself. The expedition company's operations director walked me through every detail of the encounter, methodically, professionally, confirming that I had followed protocol correctly at every stage, that the coordinates I had radioed were accurate, that my assessment of the rescue's impossibility matched the eventual findings of the recovery team. He told me at the end of that review that I had done everything right, in the specific measured tone people use when they need you to hear a fact rather than a comfort. I remember nodding, agreeing with him completely, and feeling underneath that agreement the first clear edges of the dislocation that would follow me for the rest of that year. I want to tell you what happened to me in the months that followed, because it is the part of this story that has never fully resolved, no matter how many times I have explained the mountain's arithmetic to myself in the years since. I did not experience anything I could call regret, not in the ordinary sense of wishing I had chosen differently, because I do not believe, even now, that a different choice on that specific mountain, in those specific conditions, would have produced anything other than 3 deaths instead of 1. What I experienced instead was something closer to a permanent, low-grade dislocation, a sense that some part of me had remained standing on that ridge, beside that man, and had never fully continued climbing the way the rest of me did. I did not speak with my client again for nearly a year after that expedition ended, though we had parted on good terms at the airport. Both of us still too close to what had happened to discuss it beyond the barest logistics. She called me eventually, out of nowhere, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and told me she had been carrying the same silence I had, unable to describe what we had witnessed to anyone in her life who had not been standing on that ridge beside us. We talked for nearly 2 hours that night, the first time either of us had said the man's presence out loud, to someone who did not need it explained from the beginning. And I remember feeling, by the end of that call, something loosened slightly in my chest that had been tight since the descent. We still speak occasionally, checking in on each other around the anniversary of that ascent. Two people bound together by a single shared arithmetic neither of us has ever fully finished solving. I found myself, in the months afterward, unable to walk past anyone in visible distress in ordinary life, a stranger having a difficult moment on a city sidewalk, a driver pulled over with a flat tire, without a disproportionate, almost frantic need to stop and help, as though some part of me was still trying to correct an arithmetic that had never actually been wrong in the first place. My husband noticed it before I fully admitted it to myself, commenting once, gently, that I had pulled our car over 3 times in a single week for situations that did not remotely require it. And I remember not having a good explanation to give him at the time, beyond a vague, insufficient sense that I simply could not drive past. I sat with a therapist for the better part of a year working through this, a woman who specialized unusually in wilderness and expedition trauma, someone who had worked with search and rescue teams and mountain guides before, and who did not flinch or need lengthy explanation when I described the specific arithmetic of the death zone, which was, in itself, a kind of relief I had not expected to need as badly as I did. I remember clearly the session in which she asked me directly whether I believed I had made the correct decision, and I told her yes, immediately and without hesitation. And she asked me, gently, why then it still felt like something I needed her help carrying. I sat with that question for a long time in that small office, the two of us in silence long enough that the clock on her wall became audible in a way it usually was not, and I did not have a good answer for her that day. I am not certain I have a fully good answer for you now, except to say that correctness and peace, in this particular kind of decision, do not appear to be the same thing, and that I have stopped expecting one to eventually produce the other. She told me, near the end of our work together, something I have carried with me since, that some decisions are correct and unbearable at the same time, and that the mind does not always accept a mathematically sound conclusion as sufficient grounds for peace, because peace was never actually the thing the decision was solving for in the first place. I did not find that especially comforting when she first said it. I have found myself returning to it often enough since that I think, eventually, it became something closer to comfort than I expected it to. I still guide high-altitude expeditions, and I still sit with every client in that same quiet room before departure, telling them as plainly as I ever have that they may someday face the exact choice I once faced, and that the correct decision will very likely be the one that costs them the most to make. I have added something to that conversation since my own ascent, though, a detail I did not used to include. I tell them that being correct will not protect them from what the decision costs afterward, that some part of them may remain standing on whatever ridge they eventually face, indefinitely, regardless of how sound their reasoning was in the moment. I watch their faces carefully now when I say this part. The way the room's quiet changes slightly. A few clients nodding as though absorbing a warning they had not quite known to expect. Others going very still in the particular way people go still when they are trying to imagine a version of themselves they have not yet had to become. I had a client last season ask me, after that briefing, whether I had ever actually faced the choice myself, and I told her the truth, plainly, the way I am telling you now, and I watched her sit with that information for a long moment before thanking me for it. She told me, quietly, that she was glad I had not simply told her the theory, without admitting what the theory had actually cost someone standing in front of her. I remember the specific way she looked around that small training room afterward, at the folding chairs, the worn maps pinned along one wall, as though seeing the whole space differently, now that she understood a piece of what had actually been decided inside it. I have started to believe that this, more than the technical training itself, may be the most important thing I actually offer clients now. Not the arithmetic alone, but proof that a person can survive, having lived inside it. I tell them this not to discourage them from climbing, but because I believe now that a person deserves to know the full shape of a choice before they are asked to make it, rather than only the part of it that can be justified afterward on paper. I think of that man sometimes, more often than I let most people know, not with the specific, nameable ache of grief for someone I actually knew, but with something harder to categorize, a kind of ongoing, unfinished attention, as though some quiet, permanent part of my mind has simply decided to keep watch over that particular stretch of ridge for the rest of my life. Whether or not that watching serves any purpose at all anymore. I found his name eventually, months after our expedition ended, listed in a brief notice among that season's fatalities, printed in small type, alongside several other names I did not recognize, and I have never told anyone, including my therapist, that I still say it silently to myself sometimes, on ordinary days, for no particular reason I could explain if asked, as though the saying itself is some small, private refusal to let him become only a coordinate in a radio transmission. I do not know if that impulse is grief or guilt or something closer to respect for the specific terrible clarity of what that mountain asked of both of us that day. I have stopped trying to resolve it into a single, clean feeling I could name for you tonight. The way I once believed every difficult feeling eventually resolved itself into something simpler if you sat with it long enough. I have simply learned to let it sit there, unfinished, the way the mountain itself leaves so much of what happens above that altitude, permanently, visibly, unresolved. Every season, I return to that same quiet training room, sit across from a new group of careful, hopeful climbers, and tell them the truth as completely as I know how to tell it, understanding each time that I am handing them not just a technique for surviving an impossible choice, but a small, unavoidable piece of the weight that survives alongside it. A weight I have never found a way to make lighter for anyone, including myself, no matter how many times I have described it out loud. Somewhere on that mountain there is a wood stove that was never lit. In a locked cabin a man starved inside of while surrounded by food he never touched. I have stopped asking why he did not eat. I have started asking what convinced him not to. My phone rang at 11:40 on a Friday night, and I knew before I answered it that it was going to be about the boys, because nobody else calls me that late. Dana. It was Carol, Marcus's mother, and her voice had the particular flatness people get right before the fear breaks through. They are not back. Define not back. The game let out at 9:30. Bakersfield to here is 40 minutes. It is almost midnight. I was already standing, already reaching for my keys off the hook by the door. Who drove? Marcus. In his car. Did anyone check the ballpark maybe they stopped for? Dana? Carol's voice cracked on my name, just slightly, just enough. David called me at 9:40. He said they were fine, they were getting food, they would be home by 10:30. That is the last anyone has heard from any of them. 5 men, Marcus, David, Teodoro, Jonah, and Ellis, all of them clients in my program, all of them the kind of tight, protective friend group that forms when 5 people spend a decade being underestimated by everyone except each other. I had known them for 6 years. I knew that Marcus checked his mirrors compulsively before merging. I knew that Teodoro would not eat food that had touched another food on the plate. I knew with the specific, total certainty that comes from watching someone's routines every week for years, that none of them would simply not come home. I was in my car in under 4 minutes. The sheriff's department picked up the search by 1 in the morning, and I rode along with Deputy Ruiz because I refused, flatly, to sit at home waiting for a phone call. We found Marcus's car at 2:40 on Forest Route 9, a road that led nowhere near their route home, stuck at an angle in a snowbank that had clearly claimed the tires sometime after dark. That is not possible, I said, standing at the edge of the headlights, my breath coming out in a hard white cloud. They do not know this road. None of them have ever been up here. Ruiz crouched by the driver's door, already open, dome light dead, battery long drained. Doors are unlocked, keys are gone. He reached in, careful, gloved. There is a burger wrapper on the seat, half a burger still in it. So they were eating. Looks like it. He straightened up, looked out at the tree line, dark and total beyond the reach of our lights. Then they just walked away and left the door open. They would not do that. I heard my own voice come out sharper than I meant it. The specific sharpness of someone repeating a fact because the world in front of her had stopped agreeing with it. Marcus locks doors. He locks doors at the grocery store while we are inside for 10 minutes. He does not leave a car unlocked in the middle of the night on a mountain none of them have ever seen. Ruiz did not argue with me. He just looked at the tree line a while longer, and I understood, watching him, that he was doing the same thing I was doing, trying to make the evidence fit a version of events that made sense, and failing. We searched through the night. By dawn, we had 30 people on that mountain, dogs, a helicopter once the fog lifted enough to fly. Nothing. No tracks past the first 100 yards from the car. The snow was too churned by our own search teams to preserve whatever had been there before us. Around noon, a woman from a general store 11 miles down the logging road came forward. Her name was Patricia Kellerman, and she told Ruiz, in front of me, that 4 men matching the description on our flyer had come into her store the morning after the disappearance. They bought chocolate milk, she said, and a bag of licorice, paid in exact change. She looked at me, uncertain. The way people look when they are about to say something they already expect not to be believed. 2 of them stood outside by the phone booth the whole time. Just stood there. Did not talk. Did not use the phone. Did they say where they were going? They did not say much of anything. She hesitated. There was a truck outside, a red one. I did not see who was driving it. When the 2 boys got back in it, it just pulled out, went further up the mountain, not back down toward the highway. You are sure it was them? I am sure, her jaw set. I have 3 grandchildren with Down syndrome. I know that particular kind of quiet a person gets when something is wrong, and they do not have the words for it yet. Those boys had that quiet. All 4 of them. I asked her, because I had to, why she waited 2 days to come forward. Because I did not want it to be true, she said. And because of the 4th day, I stopped being able to convince myself it was not. We searched for 11 more days. We found nothing further. The case went cold in the specific, terrible way a case goes cold when a county simply runs out of manpower to keep looking. The search scaling down from 30 volunteers to 12 to 4. And finally to me, driving the logging roads alone on my days off, with a stack of flyers and a thermos of coffee that never quite kept me warm enough. I want to tell you about the night I stopped sleeping, because it is the night everything about this search stopped being professional and became something closer to a debt I owed. 3 years before any of this, I had a client named Freddie who told me, on a supervised group outing to a lake, that he did not want to go out on the water that day. He could not tell me why. He just stood at the edge of the dock, arms crossed, saying it again and again, I do not want to go. I do not want to go. In the flat, looping way, he repeated things when something was genuinely wrong rather than simply preferred. I overruled him. I told him it was a beautiful day, that the group was going, that he would regret staying behind and missing it. I put him on the boat myself. The boat took on water 40 minutes later. A hull failure nobody could have predicted. And Freddie could not swim. And by the time we got him out of the water, he had been under long enough that he spent 6 days in a hospital and never fully regained the same clarity of speech he had before. He is alive. I want you to know that, because I have never once let myself pretend otherwise for sympathy. He is alive, and he still does not fully trust me 3 years later, and I have never once blamed him for it. I did not tell Ruiz about Freddie. I did not tell Carol, or Teodoro's mother, or anyone else standing at that trailhead with me every weekend for 3 weeks. But I carried it with me up that mountain every single time. The specific, cold knowledge that I had once decided my own read of a situation mattered more than the fear of the person actually inside it, and that I had been wrong in a way that cost someone something permanent. On the 18th day, a fisherman found Teodoro's body in a ravine 4 miles from where the car had been found. Exposure, the coroner said, though exposure did not explain why his shoes were on the wrong feet, laced correctly, as though someone else had put them on him. On the 23rd day, they found Jonah further up, near a dry creek bed, curled in a position the coroner described in his report as consistent with someone trying to make themselves as small as possible. Marcus was never found. Not that season. Not the following spring when the search resumed briefly. Not ever. And on the 31st day, a pair of off-road motorcyclists broke into a locked Forest Service maintenance cabin 11 miles past where the car had been abandoned, looking for shelter from a sudden storm, and found David. I was the one who drove up to identify him, because his own mother could not make herself do it, and because I told myself the whole drive up that I owed him at least that much certainty. One person in the room who had known him well enough to be sure. The cabin was small, one room, a cot, a wood stove stocked with split logs that had never been burned, a shelf of emergency rations still sealed in their original packaging. David was on the cot, wrapped in what the report would later specify as 8 separate sheets, layered over each other with a precision that struck me, standing in that doorway, as far too careful to be the work of a man in the final stages of starvation. He was clean-shaven the night he left, Ruiz said quietly, standing behind me. The coroner says the beard puts him alive up here for at least 6 weeks. There is food. My own voice sounded very far away. There is a stove. There is wood right there, cut and ready. I know. Why would he not eat? Why would he not light the stove? He knew how to build a fire, Ruiz. I have watched him build a fire at every single camping trip we have ever run. Ruiz did not answer, because there was no answer that fit inside anything either of us understood about how a person survives. I went back to that cabin alone 4 days later, after the investigation had officially closed and everyone else had stopped needing a reason to return. I do not fully know why. I told myself I was looking for something the initial search might have missed, some detail that would finally let the not knowing settle into something I could carry more easily. I think, if I am honest with you now, I was actually looking for permission, some physical proof in that small, cold room that would tell me none of this had anything to do with the choices I had made 3 years earlier on a lake with a boy who was trying to tell me something I refused to hear. The cabin door was unlocked when I got there, though I distinctly remembered the ranger locking it behind us the day David's body was removed. I stood in the doorway a long moment before going in, my breath fogging in the thin, cold light. The cot stripped bare now, the sheets long since taken as evidence. The rations were still on the shelf. The wood was still stacked by the stove, untouched. I crossed the room and crouched by the stove, running my fingers along the cold iron door. And it was only then that I noticed the small, careful stack of matches sitting on the floor directly in front of it. 6 of them, arranged in a neat row, none of them burned. I had photographed every surface of this cabin myself, the day David was found. I had photographed that exact stretch of floor. There had been no matches there. I heard very clearly from somewhere just outside the cabin's single window the particular low looping cadence of a voice repeating the same phrase to itself over and over, a phrase I recognized instantly, because it was the exact rhythm Freddie used when something was wrong, and he did not have other words for it yet. I did not go to the window. I want you to understand that this is the only thing I got right in that entire cabin, the only choice I made differently than I made 3 years earlier on that dock. I stayed exactly where I was, crouched by a cold stove with 6 unburned matches in front of me, and I listened to that voice circle the outside of the cabin twice, slow and unhurried, until it stopped directly outside the door. The door did not open. I did not open it either. I sat there until the light through the window had shifted from white to gray. And when I finally made myself stand and cross the room and step outside, the clearing was empty. Snow undisturbed on every side of the cabin, except the single narrow path of my own boot prints leading in. I have not gone back. I do not think I am going to. Marcus is still out there somewhere. And some nights I tell myself that is the only unfinished thing about this case. A body the mountain has simply not released yet. Weather and geography. Nothing more. Other nights I lie awake and think about 6 matches arranged in a row that were not there the day before, and about a voice repeating itself outside a locked door, in the exact rhythm of a boy I once refused to listen to. And I understand, in the particular cold, wordless way you understand, something your training has no language for, that somewhere on that mountain, something has learned precisely what it sounds like. When a person is finally ready to listen, and is simply waiting to see who comes back to prove it. There is a photograph in a shoebox in my closet that I have not looked at since October. I know exactly which face is missing from it. I know exactly whose face it should be. I have not opened that box, and some nights I convince myself I never will. Get comfortable. This one is going to sit with you for a while after it ends, and I promise you it is worth the staying. The lockbox key would not turn, and Maren Voss stood on the porch of the Halvorsen place with her breath fogging in front of her, working it left, then right, then left again, while the light behind her went the color of a bruise. So, she thought, this is what a house looks like when nobody has wanted it in 100 years. The porch boards gave under her weight in a way that felt less like rot and more like waiting. Somewhere behind her, gravel popped under tires. You are not planning to go in there alone tonight, a man's voice said. She turned. A truck idled at the end of the drive, an older man leaning out the window, county cap pushed back on gray hair. She had passed his mailbox on the way in. Arlo Prout, hand-lettered, half-peeled. I have a contract, she said. Action is Saturday. Somebody has to walk the inventory before then. Somebody does not have to do it after dark. I am not superstitious, Mr. Pruitt. I did not ask if you were superstitious, he said. I asked if you were planning to go in there alone tonight. He waited a moment, the truck engine ticking. My grandfather used to say the Halvorsens were not the first family that place tried to keep. Just the last one it managed to finish. The key turned. The door opened on a smell of cold dust and something underneath it, faint, like a stove that had not been lit in a long time, but remembered being lit. Maren lifted a hand at Arlo, more dismissal than thanks, and stepped inside before she could think better of it. Behind her, the truck did not pull away for a long moment. Then it did. Maren had been doing this work for 11 years, walking into the leftover rooms, of people who could no longer speak for themselves and deciding, in a clean, competent hand, what remained of them. A porcelain shepherdess minor chip, $12. A cedar chest, water damage, $40. She was good at it, precisely because she did not let herself feel the weight of what she was doing, only the shape of it, the inventory number, the next item. Her sister called this a gift. Her sister was wrong, but Maren had stopped correcting her. The front room of the Halvorsen house was smaller than she expected. Low-ceilinged, papered in a faded floral pattern, that had been fashionable before either of her parents were born. Furniture still sat where a family had arranged it a century ago, an estate frozen at the exact moment its owners stopped needing chairs. She set her case on the dining table, opened her laptop, and began. Rocking chair, one arm loose, 30. Wall clock stopped, hands frozen at 11:40. No resale value, sentimental only. Her phone buzzed against the table. A voicemail icon, her sister's name. She let it play once, low, half listening while she typed. Marin, it is me. I know you are working. I keep driving past Mom's place and the lawn is getting bad, and I do not want to be the one who calls someone about the lawn, so I am calling you instead. A pause. Long enough that Marin almost stopped typing. You said you would go through it before winter. It is basically winter. Marin set the phone face down on the table and kept working. In the second drawer of a mahogany sideboard, under a stack of yellowed linens, she found a tin box, the kind meant for tea, its paint worn to bare metal at the corners. Inside were photographs, brittle, curling at the edges, the family arranged stiff and unsmiling the way people used to be for cameras. A man with a heavy brow, a woman in dark wool, 2 children small enough to still be sitting on laps, and a hired girl standing slightly apart from the rest. The way hired help always stood apart, as if the frame itself understood she did not belong to the family, only to the work. One photograph near the bottom was different, the same group, the same porch, but a face at the edge of the frame had been scratched away, down to the pale backing paper. The scratches deep enough that whoever had done it must have pressed hard, and pressed for a while. Water damage, she typed, or vandalism. Minor collector interest given local history. No monetary value. She photographed it for the file and set the tin aside and told herself, the way she told herself most things now, that this was simply the job. By the time she noticed the light outside had gone from gray to gone, the wind had picked up enough to worry the loose porch board with a slow, patient creak. On, off, like something testing whether the sound still worked. She should have left an hour ago. The roads out here turned to glass after dark in November, and her car was a half-mile from cell coverage in either direction. But the front room was nearly finished, and finishing things was the one part of her that still worked without her having to try. And so she stayed, and told herself 20 more minutes, and meant it. That was when she heard, above her, the specific and unmistakable weight of a footstep. She went still. Above the front room ceiling was a half-story attic, accessed, according to the county survey stapled inside her folder, by a ladder in the back hall, a ladder that had been nailed shut across its base since the estate was sealed in 1991. Nobody had been up there in over 30 years. She counted her own heartbeat in the quiet that followed. 1, 2, 3, and heard nothing more, and told herself, so old houses settle. That is simply what old houses do at night when the temperature drops. She went back to the sideboard. 20 minutes later, working the linen closet in the hall, she found the ladder, exactly as the survey described, nailed shut, undisturbed, furred with a decade of undisturbed dust, and something in her chest loosened enough that she laughed once, short and low, at her own nerves. She decided to spend the night in her car, rather than risk the roads, parked close to the porch light with her seat back, and a thermos of coffee she had let go lukewarm without noticing the warmth of it in her gloved hands the only comfortable thing in a day that had not offered her one, and somewhere past midnight she slept without meaning to. She woke to a sound like knuckles on glass, and a shape standing at the edge of the headlights, and her whole body went cold before her mind caught up enough to recognize the county cruiser and the deputy climbing out of it. Flashlight lifted in apology. "Saw your car," the deputy said when she cracked the window. "Young, maybe 30, name tag reading Okafor. Arlo Pruitt called it in. Said you were working the Halverson place alone. Wanted to make sure you were not stuck in a ditch somewhere." "I am fine," Marin said. "Just did not want to drive tired." "Smart," Okafor said, and then glancing past her at the dark house. "Cooler in your back seat, is that yours?" "Yes. Lid is open." She turned. It was. The latch sprung, the sandwich she had packed that morning gone, only the plastic wrap left folded, almost deliberately, into a neat square and tucked back under the lid. "Raccoon, probably," Okafor said, though something in his voice had gone careful. "They get into everything out here. I did not hear anything. You were asleep." "Raccoons do not fold the wrapper," Marin said, and the deputy did not have an answer for that, only looked, for one unguarded second, toward the dark second story of the house, before he told her to lock her doors and call if she needed anything, and drove away with his lights off before he reached the road. She did not sleep again. At first light, stiff and cold-jointed, she let herself back into the house to finish what she had come to finish, 'cause that was the part of her that still functioned, and because leaving a job half-cataloged felt, this particular morning, like something she was not willing to do. The tin of photographs sat on the dining table where she had left it, except it did not. She had left it on the table's near edge, beside her laptop. It now sat at the table's far end, lined up cursed with the corner, the way a person lines something up when they want it noticed. Her mouth had gone dry enough that swallowing took effort. She opened the tin. The scratched photograph was on top now, though she had buried it at the bottom the night before, and the scratches across the missing face looked different in the morning light, brighter somehow, paler at the edges, the way a wound looks fresher than the skin around it. She told herself the light was simply different. She told herself this twice. Behind her, upstairs, something crossed the floor, unhurried, the way a person crosses a room they know well in the dark. Marin stood in the front hall with the tin still in her hand, and made herself do the arrhythmic a rational person does. The ladder was nailed shut. She had checked it herself. There was no other way into that attic, not from outside. The second-story windows were boarded from within. She had confirmed it walking the exterior for her survey photos. And yet the floor above her creaked again, closer to the stairwell now. A weight settling from one board onto the next. Patient, unbothered by the hour, by the cold, by the fact that the house had been locked and empty for 30 years. She thought, absurdly, about whether she had locked her car. It was such a small, foolish thought, wedged sideways into a moment, that deserved something larger, and she almost laughed at herself for having it, except that some old, buried part of her recognized what the thought actually was, a place for her mind to stand that was not the floor above her, and she let it hold her there a moment longer than she should have, turning over whether she had thumbed the lock button before she got out. She had. She was almost sure she had. The footsteps stopped directly above the hall ceiling. Something in her tightened hands. jaw, the base of her throat. A tremor she noticed only when she tried to set the tin back on the table, and could not make her fingers open cleanly around it. She thought of Arlo Pruitt's grandfather. She thought of a hayloft 100 years and half a world away. A killer who had lived unseen in a family's own house for days before he was ready, patient, in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with waiting for something to be complete. She had read the file on the drive out, professional habit, know the property, know the history. 6 dead, the killer never found, smoke from the chimney days after, as if whoever did it had simply stayed on, moved in, finished settling into a life that was no longer anyone's but his. She had thought, reading it in her car, with her coffee going cold. How strange. How are you not sick with fear before you finish something like that? She understood now, standing in the hall with her hand shaking around a 100-year-old tin box, that she had been asking the wrong question. It was never about fear. It was about whether you were the kind of person who could stand inside an unfinished thing and simply wait it out to the end. Her feet were moving before she decided to move them. She told herself, later, that she went to prove the ladder was still nailed shut, to lay the sound to rest with evidence, the way she laid every uncertain thing to rest. But the truth she never said out loud to anyone was that her body carried her down that back hall, the way a hand reaches for a bruise, testing whether it still hurts, unable to leave it alone. The ladder was not nailed shut. The boards lay stacked neatly to one side, dust undisturbed on their top side, as if they had been lifted straight up and set down with care rather than pried loose. Above her, the attic hatch stood open onto black. "Hello," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to, swallowed almost before it reached the top of the ladder. Nothing answered. Somewhere above her, faint, she heard what might have been breathing, slow and even, the breathing of something entirely unbothered by being heard. She climbed. The attic smelled of straw that should not exist in a house with no barn attached, and beneath that, wood smoke, fresh, impossibly fresh, curling from a chimney flue that ran cold through every other room in the house. A nest of old blankets sat pressed into one corner, the shape of a body worn into them, recent, the fibers still holding their crease. Beside it, laid out with a precision that turned her stomach before her mind understood why, sat a second tin, twin to the one downstairs, its lid open, empty, waiting. "I know what you are cataloging," she said, to the dark, to the breathing, to whatever patience had been keeping this house company for 100 years. And her voice this time did not shake, because some part of her had already decided that if this was the moment, she stopped being afraid and started being something else entirely. She would rather meet it standing there than crawl back down that ladder on her knees. "You are not finished. You have never been finished." The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, she understood, with a clarity that felt less like a thought than a hand closing around her wrist, that the house had not been waiting for a family to complete again, the way she had half assumed, half hoped, reading the old file in her car with the heat running. It had been waiting for someone who understood what it meant to leave a life uncatalogued. Someone who walked into the unfinished rooms of the dead for a living, and called it work, and told herself it was only work, while her own mother's house sat closed and dark and utterly unfinished, 11 miles from where she now knelt. Something moved in the dark at the edge of her vision, low, unhurried, and she was down the ladder and through the front hall and out the door into a cold gray morning. Before she let herself feel any of it, the tin box still, impossibly, in her hand, though she did not remember picking it back up. She did not go back inside. She called the auction house from the end of the driveway, voice steadier than she had any right to expect, and told them the front room was catalogued, that someone else would need to finish the second story, that she was recusing herself from the remainder of the job for reasons she did not attempt to explain. Arlo Pruitt's truck sat at the end of his own drive as she passed, and he did not wave, only watched her go the way a man watches weather he has already seen arrive once before. She drove the 11 miles to her mother's house without deciding to. The lawn was as bad as her sister had said. She sat in the driveway a long time before she went in, the tin box on the passenger seat beside her. And when she finally opened her mother's front door, the smell that met her was not decay, only stillness, only a life that had stopped mid-sentence and never been allowed to finish. That night, in her own apartment, she opened the tin from the Halverson attic one last time, meaning to photograph it properly for a report she was no longer sure she would file. The scratched photograph sat on top, the way it always seemed to arrange itself. Except the face was no longer scratched away. It was simply gone, the paper beneath it smooth and pale and utterly blank, waiting. The way a page waits before anyone has written on it. And Marin sat very still in her kitchen for a long time, listening to her own refrigerator hum, before she understood that the blankness was not an absence at all. It was an invitation. She has not looked at it since. There is a phrase in a language I do not speak that I now say in my sleep. My sister told me this. I do not remember saying it. I remember waking up already knowing it was true. This one moves slowly, the way real fear does, and I think you will feel it settle in before you understand why. You cannot keep saying it belongs to the archive, Priya said, sliding the folder back across the table so hard it nearly went off the edge. You said that about the Beaumont files, too. 6 months, Wren. 6 months, and a stack of interlibrary loans I had to sign my own name to. Wren Okafor did not look up from the photograph she was scanning, a poor quality print of a dead man's face, smoothed by a mortuary artist into something almost peaceful. This is different. It is always different. The DNA gave him a name. It did not give him an explanation. Wren set the photograph down, careful the way she handled everything that used to belong to someone. Charles Webb had a wife, a daughter he never met. Nobody has ever explained why his clothes had no labels, why he was carrying a phrase that means it is ended, why the woman whose number was written in that book denied knowing him until the day she died. I am not chasing a name anymore. I am chasing what actually happened to him. Priya studied her for a moment too long. You know that is not your job. It became my job the second the state library agreed to digitize the code, and I was the one who asked for it first. The Kenneth Slessor reading room at the state library kept a particular kind of cold, the cold of old stone that the ocean air got into 100 years ago and had never quite left, and Wren had taken to working there after closing. On the archivist's odd hours, the library extended to researchers with the right permissions, and, she suspected, not enough sense to go home. The code sat open on the table in front of her now, 5 lines of looping capital letters photographed from the back page of a 76-year-old book. Letters that had defeated the Australian government's own cryptographic unit in 1949 and every serious codebreaker since. Wurgo ababd. Mlioe wet bimpanetp. Mliaboayakse itm samstgab. She had them memorized before she meant to. Somewhere past 9, the overhead lights in the reading room dimmed on their automatic timer. 1 bank at a time, the way they did every night, and Wren barely noticed anymore, except that the room always felt a half-degree colder in the dark, a smell rising off the older shelves that she had started to think of, privately, as the smell of paper remembering something. Her phone buzzed. Her sister. Mom asked again if you were coming Sunday. I told her yes. Do not make me a liar. Wren typed back, coming, and did not send it, and set the phone face down, the way she had learned to do with anything that asked her to think about her family for longer than a sentence at a time. It was nearly 10 when she noticed the corner missing from her own paperback. She had brought a second-hand copy of the Rubaiyat with her, an ordinary modern edition, nothing rare, meant only as a reference while she cross-checked the historical text against the fragment sewn into Charles Webb's pocket. She had not opened it in an hour. Now the final page carried a clean triangular tier corner to corner, precisely where the scrap in 1948 had been torn from its own copy. That is not funny, she said aloud to the empty room, and heard how strange her own voice sounded against all that stone. She checked her bag. She checked the desk, the floor beneath it, the gap behind the radiator where a page might have blown if a window had been open, which it had not, because the reading room windows had been sealed for climate control since the 1980s. There was no torn scrap anywhere. There was only the tier itself and the absence where the paper used to be. She told herself, the way she told herself most things now, that she had torn it herself weeks ago, distracted, and simply forgotten. That was, after all, the entire architecture of her professional life, that a fragment could tell the truth, even when a person could not remember producing it. She photographed the tier for her notes, closed the book, and kept working, because that was the part of her that still functioned no matter what. By midnight, the code had rearranged itself in her head into something that felt, for the first time in 6 months, almost like a shape. She tried the second line against a known Australian cipher pattern used by the wartime signals unit and got nothing. Tried it phonetically against Persian transliteration and got closer to nothing, and was reaching for her thermos of tea, gone lukewarm hours ago. Comforting anyway, in the way that lukewarm things sometimes are at midnight, in an empty room, when the reading room's front door, locked since 9, clicked open down the corridor. She went still. "Hello?" she called. Nothing answered. She counted 3 of her own heartbeats before a second sound came. Softer. A page turning somewhere in the closed stacks behind the reference desk. A section she knew for a fact was keyed only to senior archivists. Security, she said to herself, low, testing the word for how much she believed it. Somebody doing a walkthrough. She went to check anyway, because the part of her that named the unclaimed dead had never once, in 11 years, been able to leave an open door unexplained. The stacks were empty. The aisle lights, motion-triggered, clicked on ahead of her one section at a time as she walked, which she told herself was simply how they worked, though it had never before felt like something walking a half step ahead of her rather than something responding to her. At the far end where the library kept its uncatalogued donations, a single volume sat pulled halfway off its shelf, spine out, waiting. It was a copy of the Rubaiyat, older than hers. Older, she thought, with a cold drop low in her stomach, than it had any right to be sitting in a general donations pile that had not been processed since before she started here. She did not want to open it. She opened it anyway. The flyleaf carried handwriting in faded pencil, a phone number, 7 digits. The exact looping hand from every photograph of the 1948 evidence she had studied for 6 months, and beneath the number, in the same hand, a single line that had not been in any photograph, any file, any transcript she had ever seen. Tell Wren it is not finished. She did not remember deciding to run. She remembered the corridor going past her too fast. The front door somehow already open when she reached it, though she had heard no one pass her, and the cold outside air hitting her face like something physically stopping her, and only then did she notice her own hands were shaking too hard to get her car key into the lock. She sat in her car, in the library car park for 11 minutes by the dashboard clock, breathing, telling herself the handwriting was a coincidence. That pencil on old paper always looked similar, that someone on staff was playing a prank, cruel and elaborate, but explicable. And somewhere in the 11th minute, she thought, absurdly, whether she had paid for the car park before 9, whether the ticket machine took cards after hours, a small, stupid worry that occupied her mind for a full 30 seconds before she understood what it was. Her own head handing her something manageable, so it would not have to hold the other thing. She had paid. She always paid. She drove home with both hands locked on the wheel. For 3 days, nothing happened, and she almost let herself believe that was the end of it. On the 4th day, her editor at the Identification Project called to ask why the byline on her last 2 published case reports read R. Okafor, initial only, no first name, when every previous report she had filed in 11 years carried her name in full. Wren pulled up the files herself. The initial was there, in the metadata, in the print archive, in the digital record, consistent across every version, as if it had always been that way, though she remembered typing her name in full each time, the way she always did, the way it mattered to her that it always did, because giving a full name back to someone who had lost theirs was the entire point of the work. It has always said that, her editor said, confused by her tone. Since you started, it has not. Wren, I have the original submission emails. Do you want me to forward them? She did want that. She opened the forwarded email with her hands not quite steady and found her own name, typed by her own fingers 11 years ago, already reading R. Okafor, and beneath it, unreadable at first, because her mind simply refused it, a line she had never written, in her own font, her own signature block, a line that had not been there when she sent the original message, and was there now. Tamam Shud, it is ended. She called her sister that night, meaning to ask something she could not fully name, and got only 3 sentences in before her sister said, gently, carefully, the way people speak to someone they are worried about. Wren, who is this? It is me. It is Wren. A pause too long. I do not know a Wren. Aisha, it is your sister. I only have a brother, her sister said, and her voice had the particular flatness of someone telling the truth as she understood it. No cruelty in it at all, only confusion, only a closed door where an open one used to be. I do not have a sister. Is this a joke? Whose number is this? Wren stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and the line still open, and felt something in her chest go very quiet. The way a room goes quiet right before a held breath finally lets go, and understood, with a clarity that felt less like a thought than a hand closing gently around her wrist, what the code had actually been counting toward the entire time she had been trying to break it. It was not a message. It was a countdown. She thought of Charles Webb, 73 years unnamed. Every label cut from his clothes. A phrase sewn into a hidden pocket, meaning it is ended. And she understood, too late, what her own profession had never let her ask honestly in 11 years of naming the forgotten dead. Not how does a person lose their name? How does a person stop being the kind of person anyone remembers well enough to look for? Her brother had been missing 19 years. Nobody had searched for him properly in at least 15 of those. She had told herself she was too busy with other people's unclaimed dead to open that particular file herself, and had believed, or made herself believe, that this was a kind of love, a way of tending the wound sideways rather than looking straight at it. The line was still open. She could hear her sister breathing on the other end, patient, unbothered, waiting for an answer that made sense. "Sorry," Wren said finally, very quietly. "Wrong number." She hung up before her sister could agree. She did not sleep. Near 4 in the morning she took the modern paperback Rubaiyat from her bag, the one with the torn corner she had explained away 3 weeks earlier, and held the torn triangle of missing paper up to the light, turning it, the way she had turned 100 fragments, belonging to 100 unclaimed strangers, looking for the shape that would tell her what it had once been part of. It fit precisely against the torn page in the older volume from the library stacks, the one she had not returned, the one that now sat on her kitchen table, though she did not remember bringing it home. 2 torn edges from 2 different books, decades apart, matched exactly the way only a single original page, torn once, long ago, and somehow split again across time, could match. On the flyleaf beneath the pencil-lead phone number. In the looping hand she now recognized without wanting to. One more line had appeared that had not been there in the library 4 nights before. Her own name, Info, correctly spelled, not crossed out, not erased, simply quietly not yet finished. There is a stone in the woods that is not always in the same place. I have looked for it 3 times since, in daylight, with a compass and a partner and a camera, and I have never found it again on purpose. I only ever find it when I am not looking. That is the part I have never told anyone. The call came in at 6:40 in the morning, which meant someone had already been missing all night before anyone thought to be afraid. Female, 34. Day hiking with her husband on the long trail spur near Glastonbury Summit. Dispatch said. Husband says she was 15 feet ahead of him on the trail. He looked down to check his phone. When he looked up, she was gone. I was already pulling my boots on. 15 feet, that is what he is saying. Time of last contact, 4:15 yesterday afternoon. I did the math without wanting to. 14 hours. In October, in Vermont, at altitude, 14 hours was not yet the number that ended searches. But it was close enough that I felt my stomach do the thing it always did now. A small, cold drop that had nothing to do with the temperature. Dale was already at the trailhead when I pulled in, leaning against the truck with 2 coffees he had not touched. because Dale never drank his coffee until I got there. A habit of his I had never asked him to explain, and had quietly come to depend on more than I liked to admit. "You good?" he asked, handing me the cup. "I am fine." "You are allowed to not be fine." "I know what I am allowed to do, Dale." I said it sharper than I meant to, and he let it sit there without pushing, which was its own kind of kindness. The specific kindness of someone who had watched me not be fine before, and had learned exactly how much room to give it. The husband's name was Marcus Whitfield, and he was standing near the trailhead sign, with a blanket around his shoulders, that a state trooper must have given him sometime in the night, though the morning was not cold enough to need it. He had the particular stillness of a person who had been asked to repeat the same 4 minutes of his life so many times that the telling had started to feel more real than the memory. "Tell me again," I said, because I needed to hear it in his own words, not the dispatcher's summary of his words. We were maybe 2 miles in. She was ahead of me. She always walks faster than me. She likes to get ahead and then wait. His voice caught on likes, present tense, and I watched him hear himself do it and not correct it. I looked down to check the trail map on my phone. Maybe 5 seconds. When I looked up, she was not on the trail. "Did you hear anything?" A call out, a fall, brush moving. Nothing. He said it plainly, which was worse than if he had said it desperately. There was nothing to hear. I looked at the trail behind him. A straight, well-maintained stretch through hemlock and birch. No switchbacks, no blind curves for at least 40 yards in either direction. 15 feet of open trail did not simply stop being visible in 5 seconds. I had spent 11 years reading terrain for exactly this kind of contradiction. The story that did not match the geography, and every part of my training told me that geography was lying, or Marcus Whitfield was, or something in between the two that I had not yet found the shape of. "We are going to find her," I told him, because it was the thing you say, and because I still believed, at 7 in the morning, that I meant it completely. We started the grid search by 8. I put 6 teams on the mountain by 9, and by noon we had covered nearly 4 square miles of terrain radiating out from the point where Marcus said she had last been visible, and we had found nothing. Not a broken branch, not a single displaced stone. Elena Whitfield's boot print stopped, cleanly, exactly where her husband said it had, a clear tread mark pressed into soft trail mud, and then simply did not continue in any direction our best trackers could find. "This does not track," said Priya, one of my newer volunteers, kneeling at the print with a flashlight even though it was full daylight, the beam useless against the canopy's deep green shade. "There is no drag mark, no scuff. It is like she stepped up instead of forward. People do not step up off a flat trail. I know. That is what I am telling you." I crouched beside her and looked at the print myself, the clean heel strike, the slightly deeper impression at the toe that told me she had been walking at a normal pace, unhurried, a woman simply out for a hike with her husband on an ordinary Tuesday. I have read 1,000 prints in my career. I have never once seen one end the way this one ended, complete and confident, and then simply absent, as though the next step had happened somewhere the ground did not exist to record it. It was somewhere around that print, kneeling in the mud with Priya, that I first saw the stone. It sat maybe 30 feet off the trail, low and flat and gray, not a boulder exactly, more the size of a car hood, half sunk into moss with a shallow, smooth depression worn into its center. The kind of hollow you sometimes see in old millstones or grinding rocks left behind by people who worked this land long before any of us. I did not think much of it in the moment. I noted it the way I note every unusual feature on a search, filed it as a landmark, took a photo for the log, and moved on. It looked old. It looked like it had been there longer than the trail itself. I remember thinking, distantly, that it was a strange, almost deliberate place for a stone like that to sit. Off the path, but not hidden, visible enough that a person walking past would notice it, without ever fully looking at it. We searched until dark. We found nothing. That night, back at the ranger station, going over the day's grid coverage with Dale and the county sheriff, I pulled up the historical case file I had sworn to myself years ago I would never open again on an active search, because opening it never once helped, and always cost me something I did not have room to spend during a working search. I opened it anyway. Caleb Ostrander, 16 years old. Missing on this same mountain 5 years ago this coming spring. Last seen by 2 friends who told investigators, in almost the exact same flat, disbelieving tone Marcus Whitfield had used that morning, that he had been walking a few steps ahead of them on a clear stretch of trail, and then he simply was not. I had led that search too. I had made the call on the second day to concentrate our remaining resources on the eastern ridge, based on terrain modeling I still believed, even now, was the correct read of where a frightened 16-year-old boy would most likely go. I was wrong. Or I was right, and it did not matter, because we never found him at all, not on the eastern ridge, not anywhere. And the case had closed 5 years later with his name still listed as missing, presumed lost to exposure, a phrase I have never once been able to say out loud without feeling it land somewhere just beneath my ribs. "You are doing the thing," Dale said, watching me from across the table. "What thing?" "The thing where you go quiet and your jaw does the tight thing. And I know you are back on the Ostrander case, even though nobody said his name out loud." Somebody just said his name out loud. That was me proving a point. He slid his own coffee toward me, untouched again, an offering rather than a correction. "This is not that search, Reyes. Different mountain conditions, different profile, different everything. Same mountain. Vermont has a lot of mountains. Not this one." I closed the laptop harder than I needed to. "This exact one, Dale. Same trail system. Almost the same time of year." He did not have an answer for that, and I did not expect one, because there was not a professional answer to give. Only the kind of uneasy coincidence you file away and keep working around. The way you keep working around a stone in your boot when stopping to remove it costs you daylight you cannot spare. We were back on the mountain before sunrise the next morning, and it was Priya, again, who found the second thing that did not track, this time nearly a mile from where Elena Whitfield had vanished, in a stretch of terrain none of our teams had walked the day before. The stone was there too. Not a stone that looked like the first one. The same stone. The same flat gray shape with the same shallow, worn hollow in its center. Sitting half sunk into moss in a completely different section of forest. Nearly a mile from where I had photographed it and logged its coordinates less than 24 hours earlier. "That is not possible," Priya said, and I remember the specific careful flatness in her voice, the tone of someone deciding in real time whether saying the sentence out loud made it more or less true. I pulled up the photo from my phone, held it beside the stone in front of us. Same shape, same depression, worn smooth, in the exact same asymmetrical pattern. A detail too specific to be coincidence, too specific to be two different stones that simply happened to look alike. I felt something cold move down through my arms that had nothing to do with the October air. My mouth going dry in a way I did not immediately register as fear so much as simple, professional confusion, the particular unease of a tracker, looking at evidence that refuses to hold still. Could someone have moved it? I said, already knowing how absurd the question was, even as I asked it. A stone that size would have taken heavy equipment and several hours, in terrain with no vehicle access, overnight without leaving a single mark of the effort. Nobody moved that, Priya said. Look at the moss. It has grown into the base on both sides. That takes years, not a night. I did not have an answer for her. I logged the second sighting anyway. Coordinates, photograph, a note in my own field log that I wrote in language so carefully neutral that rereading it later felt like reading someone else's report. Someone determined not to let themselves see what they had actually seen. We searched for 4 more days. On the 4th day, we found Elena Whitfield's jacket. Folded, not torn, not discarded in a struggle. Folded and set with something close to care. The base of a birch tree, 2 ridgelines from where she had vanished, in terrain so steep and remote that reaching it on foot from her last known position would have taken a fit, experienced hiker the better part of 6 hours. Terrain she had never demonstrated any experience navigating. Marcus Whitfield identified the jacket by video call, his face going gray and still on the small screen, and he asked me, in a voice stripped down to something almost childlike, whether folded meant she had done it herself. I do not know yet, I told him, because it was true, and because every other answer I could think of felt worse than the not knowing. I went back to that birch tree alone the following morning, before my team arrived, before the light had fully come up through the canopy, because something about the folded jacket had kept me awake most of the night, a detail that did not fit any pattern of confusion or panic I had ever seen in a lost person's behavior. Lost people do not fold their clothing. Lost people, in the confusion of realizing they cannot find the trail again, do not sit down and neatly arrange a jacket at the base of a tree the way you might leave something for someone else to find. The stone was there too. I stood in the gray half-dark morning looking at it, sitting exactly where the jacket had been, as though it had simply been under the jacket the whole time. Though I knew, with the same flat certainty I had felt reading Caleb Ostrander's file 2 nights earlier, that it had not been there when we recovered the jacket the previous afternoon. I had photographed that spot. I had photographed the empty ground beneath the tree, bare dirt and old leaves, nothing else. I crouched down beside it anyway, because 11 years of training does not simply stop functioning, even when everything in you understands that what you are looking at should not be possible. I ran my fingers along the smooth, hollow worn into its center, cold and slightly damp under my hand, and I felt, standing there alone in the half-light with my team still 20 minutes out, a specific, narrowing pressure behind my eyes that made the whole clearing seem to draw closer around me. The trees at the edge of my vision losing their individual shapes and becoming simply a wall of gray-green pressing in. I told myself it was low blood sugar. I had skipped breakfast again, the way I always did on the third or fourth day of a hard search, running on coffee and the particular fuel of not wanting to stop moving long enough to eat. I stood up too fast, testing the theory, and the clearing swayed once, gently, the way a boat sways, rather than the way solid ground should ever move. And I put a hand out to steady myself against the birch tree, and found the birch tree was not where my hand expected it to be. It took me a full second longer than it should have to find it again. I did not tell Dale about that second. I have not told anyone about that second, not fully, not in the way I am telling you now. I finished the morning's search brief with my team, as though nothing had happened, because there is a version of this job where you learn to keep functioning through fear, the same way you learn to keep functioning through cold or exhaustion, treating it as simply another condition of the terrain, rather than a message the terrain might be trying to send you directly. We found nothing more of Elena Whitfield. The search was formally suspended 11 days after it began, transitioning, in the language the county uses for cases like this, from active search to open investigation, a phrase that means, in practice, that the searchers go home and the family is left holding a question with no edges left to search. I drove Marcus Whitfield to the airport myself, 3 weeks later. After he had finally accepted there was nothing left for him to do on the mountain, and somewhere on that quiet early highway, watching the Vermont hills go by gray and closed in the rearview mirror, he asked me the question I understood, the moment he said it, that I had been waiting for someone to ask me since the day Caleb Ostrander's file first opened itself back up on my laptop. "Do you think it was something on the mountain?" he said. "Not something that happened to her, something the mountain did." I did not answer him right away. I have spent 11 years being the person other people trust to give them a clean, professional answer to exactly this kind of question, an answer built on terrain modeling and behavioral prediction, and the specific hard-won confidence of someone who has found more lost people than she has ever lost. I opened my mouth to give him that answer, the one my training has always handed me automatically, and found, for the first time in my career, that I did not actually have it ready. "I think," I said finally, "that I used to believe I could read any piece of ground well enough to know where a person had gone. I do not believe that anymore." He did not ask me to explain further, and I did not offer to. We drove the rest of the way in a silence that felt, oddly, less lonely than the silence I had been carrying alone in my own truck every night since the search began. I still lead searches on that mountain. I have not been able to bring myself to stop, and I am not certain, if I am honest with you, whether that is courage or simply the same stubbornness that has always made me good at this work. The refusal to accept that a piece of ground could ever hold something my training was not equipped to find. I keep the photograph of that stone on my phone still. The first one, taken in ordinary daylight beside an ordinary boot print that stopped where a boot print should never stop. And some nights, scrolling back through old search logs the way other people might scroll through old messages from someone they lost, I find myself looking at it for longer than I mean to, waiting, the way you wait for a word to stop looking like a word, for it to finally resolve into something I can explain. It never does. I do not think it is going to. I think, now, that the mountain was never testing whether I could find my way through it. I think it was testing whether I could admit there are pieces of ground no amount of expertise will ever let a person fully read, and that the specific, particular danger of being as good at this work as I am is the certainty that comes with it, the quiet, professional confidence that has kept me moving forward on 100 searches, and that walked me, without a single moment of hesitation, straight up to a stone that was never in the same place twice, and let me kneel beside it anyway, because some part of me still believed, even then, that I was the kind of person the ground could not fool. I do not believe that anymore. I go back to Glastonbury anyway, every time the call comes in, because somewhere on that mountain there is still a missing 16-year-old boy, and a missing woman who folded her own jacket at the base of a tree. And because I have come to understand, slowly, that the job was never about being someone the mountain could not fool. It was only ever about being someone willing to keep walking into it anyway, certain or not, and carrying home whatever the walking cost. A man once spent 50 years hanging dolls in trees to appease a girl he may or may not have actually seen drown, and at the end of those 50 years he was found dead in the exact same water. I have spent my career preserving rituals like his for museums, keeping a careful, professional distance from the grief inside them, certain that distance was a discipline rather than a defense. I no longer trust that distance the way I once did. I want to tell you about an island of dolls before I tell you about the shrine I am currently failing to catalog objectively, because the island taught me exactly how a ritual can outlive the grief it was built to hold, and grow into something that consumes the person tending it instead, slowly enough that the person inside it rarely notices the exact moment the balance tips. In the canals south of Mexico City, a reclusive man named Julian Santana Barrera spent roughly 50 years of his life hanging discarded dolls from the trees of a small isolated island, a ritual he began, according to the account he gave for the rest of his life, after finding the body of a young girl who had drowned in the water just beside his home. He believed her spirit remained there, unable to rest, and he hung the first doll he found floating in the canal soon after her death as an offering meant to comfort her. One doll was never enough. He spent the following 5 decades scavenging dumps and trading produce, for more, hanging them in increasing numbers across every tree the island offered, some intact, many disfigured by weather and time into something considerably more unsettling than comfort was ever meant to look like. Faces stained and cracked, limbs missing, eyes clouded, white or gone entirely. The accumulated weight of 5 decades of a single unfinished gesture, repeated so many times, it eventually became something closer to a landscape than a memorial. Even his own family, in the years since, has openly doubted whether the girl he described ever actually existed, whether the whole elaborate, decades-long ritual was built atop of grief for someone who was, in the most literal sense, never entirely real to begin with. A possibility that unsettles me more, if I am honest, than any confirmed haunting ever could. I find that particular uncertainty more unsettling than almost anything else about the story. The possibility that an entire life-structuring devotion may have been built around a loss that never technically occurred, and that the devotion itself never once required verification to become real and total and consuming. What is not in dispute is how his own life ended. In 2001, His body was found floating in the exact same spot where he always claimed the girl had drowned, decades earlier, the ritual he built to honor her concluding, finally, with his own death inside its center. I have thought about that specific arc more than almost anything else in my professional life, a ritual that never once let its keeper finish grieving. 50 years of always one more doll, never enough until the ritual quietly became the entire remaining shape of a man's life rather than something contained within it, a transformation so gradual that no single year of it would have looked especially alarming from the outside. I am a folk art conservator, working mostly on contract for regional museums and cultural heritage organizations, spending far more of my time than people expect kneeling in overgrown roadside grass, or wading through humid, insect-thick brush documenting sites most of the world drives past without ever noticing. My work involves cataloging and preserving exactly this category of site: roadside shrines, memorial gardens, the elaborate, obsessive structures grief sometimes builds when it has nowhere else sanctioned to go. My training has always emphasized a very specific, deliberate distance, documenting the objects and the pattern of their construction thoroughly, professionally, without ever allowing myself to step emotionally inside the belief system that produced them. I have always believed that distance was the entire discipline of my job, the thing that let me do this work for years, without it costing me anything of my own. I want to tell you about the first time that distance actually failed me. Before I tell you about the assignment currently testing it again. 8 years ago, I was contracted to document and help preserve a roadside memorial in rural Georgia, built over nearly a decade by a woman named Colette Reyes, following the death of her teenage son in a car accident at that specific location. What began as a modest cross and a scattering of flowers had grown, over the years, into an elaborate, sprawling structure. Hundreds of small, handwritten notes laminated against the weather. Wind chimes numbering in the dozens. A rotating collection of his own belongings replaced and rearranged with an increasingly ritualized precision. I remember my first afternoon on that site, standing at the edge of the road with a clipboard and a camera, feeling the particular, professional confidence of someone who has done this kind of work many times before and does not expect this project to be meaningfully different from any other. I spent nearly 4 months working alongside her on that project, cataloging each edition, interviewing her extensively about the meaning behind specific objects and their placement, sitting with her for hours at a time on a folding chair she kept permanently set up near the largest of the wind chime clusters. I want to be honest that somewhere in those 4 months, the professional distance I had always relied on simply stopped holding the way it was supposed to. I found myself, by the end of that project, unable to leave the site at the end of a working day, without first walking its entire perimeter myself, checking that nothing had been disturbed, a habit that had nothing to do with my actual job and everything to do with a need I did not fully understand at the time. I remember the specific evening I first noticed myself doing it, standing at the far edge of the site, well after Colette had already driven home, unable to explain to myself why I was still there, why leaving without one more circuit of the memorial felt, in that moment, genuinely unsafe, rather than simply unnecessary. I began bringing small offerings of my own, Nothing significant. A stone, a flower. Gestures I told myself were simply professional courtesy toward a grieving client, and that I understand now, with the benefit of distance, had already crossed well past the boundary my training was built to maintain. I kept a small collection of smooth creek stones in my car, specifically for this purpose, replenishing them whenever the supply ran low, a habit so quietly automatic by the end of those 4 months that I did not consciously register it as unusual until long after the project had ended. Colette herself, to her credit, noticed this shift in me before I did, gently asking, near the end of our work together, whether I had someone in my own life I was grieving, a question I brushed aside at the time and have thought about often since, because I did not then have a clear answer for her, and I am not certain I fully do now either. I left that project eventually, professionally completed, the memorial cataloged and preserved, exactly as my contract required, and I did not fully understand what had happened to me during those 4 months, until nearly a year later, in a session with a therapist, I had started seeing for reasons that felt, at the time, unrelated to my work. I remember describing the Georgia project to her almost in passing, an anecdote I offered as background rather than as the subject I actually needed to be discussing. And I remember the specific, careful way she slowed the conversation down. Once I mentioned perimeter walks, asking me to describe them again in more detail than I had originally offered. She asked me, almost offhandedly, why I had described walking that memorial's perimeter as something I needed to do, rather than something the job required. And I remember sitting with that question for a long time, recognizing, slowly, that I had spent 4 months, quietly, building my own small, private ritual alongside Colette's, one I had never once acknowledged consciously. Tied to a grief of my own I had never properly examined, a miscarriage years earlier I had told almost no one about and had certainly never connected, until that session, to the compulsive care I had poured into a stranger's memorial, to her own lost child. I had not marked that loss with any object, any ritual, any repeated gesture of my own at the time it happened, telling myself, in the immediate aftermath, that moving forward quickly and quietly was the healthier choice. And I understand now that the grief simply went looking, years later, for the first structure patient enough to finally hold it. I remember the specific physical sensation of that realization arriving, a kind of cold drop through my chest that had nothing to do with anything in the room around me, and everything to do with a door I had not realized I was standing directly in front of. I want to tell you about the assignment currently sitting open on my desk, because it has returned me to that same unresolved question with a force I did not expect to feel again this strongly. 6 weeks ago, I was contracted to document a Bayou memorial site in rural Louisiana, built over the past 11 years by a man named Desmond Aldous, following the drowning death of his young daughter in the slow, dark water beside his property. I remember driving out to that property for the first time, the road narrowing steadily into unpaved track the closer I got, cypress trees pressing close enough on either side that the daylight seemed to thin and green, well before I ever reached the water itself. What I found on my first visit was a structure eerily reminiscent of the Mexican island I have spent years using as a teaching example in my own professional training. Dozens of dolls and small toys hung from the cypress trees ringing the water's edge, weathered by humidity and time into something considerably more unsettling than the gentle memorial intention behind them. Desmond told me, in our first conversation, sitting across from me at a plain wooden table in his small house within sight of the water, that he adds something new to the site every year on the anniversary of her death, and has done so without a single missed year since. A level of ritual consistency I recognized immediately and uncomfortably from both Julian Santana Barrera's 50-year devotion and my own 4 months in Georgia. He spoke about her and about the ritual with a calm, practiced steadiness that I understood. Even in that first conversation, as its own kind of armor, the specific fluency of someone who has explained this particular grief so many times that the explanation itself has become part of the structure holding him together. I have spent these 6 weeks documenting his site. With the same professional thoroughness I have always brought to this work, and I want to be honest that I have also spent these 6 weeks watching myself more closely than I ever have before, for the specific signs I now know to look for in myself. Desmond told me something during our 3rd week together that I have not been able to stop turning over since. We were sitting at his kitchen table, the window behind him, framing a narrow view of the water through the trees, and he mentioned, almost in passing, that he sometimes catches himself talking to the dolls the way he used to talk to his daughter, asking them, without quite meaning to, whether they are cold, whether they are comfortable, small automatic tendernesses that have simply migrated over 11 years from a living child to a collection of weathered plastic hanging from cypress branches. He said it lightly, almost as a joke at his own expense, and then grew quiet for a long moment afterward, watching the water rather than me, and I understood, in that silence, that he was testing whether I would react to it the way most people apparently did, with the kind of gentle, worried concern that made him feel. He told me later, like a patient rather than a father. I did not react that way. I told him, honestly, that I understood the impulse better than he probably expected a contracted conservator to admit, and I watched something in his shoulders ease slightly at hearing that. The same small, grateful loosening I remembered from Colette Ray's 8 years earlier, when she realized I was not simply documenting her grief from a clinical distance. I have thought since about how easily that moment of genuine connection could become, if I let it, exactly the kind of boundary collapse my training has always warned me against. And how difficult it now is for me to tell, in the moment itself, whether offering someone that kind of understanding is professional empathy, or the first quiet step of my own ritual beginning to take shape. I found myself, 2 weeks into the project, walking the perimeter of his memorial alone one evening, after Desmond had already gone inside for the night, checking, without any professional reason to be doing so, that each doll remained exactly where it had been documented in my notes the day before. I remember the specific quality of that evening light, low and greenish through the cypress canopy, insects loud enough to fill the silence Desmond's absence had left behind, and I remember catching myself mid-step, halfway around the site's perimeter, with the sudden disorienting question of how long I had actually been standing there before I noticed myself doing it. I stood there in the humid, insect-loud dark for longer than I should have, watching the slow water move almost imperceptibly past the cypress roots, and I felt something move through me that I recognize now as the same cold, wordless pull I felt 8 years ago in Georgia. A pull that has nothing to do with professional diligence and everything to do with something in me that has never fully finished its own grieving. I noticed with a specific unease that my hand had drifted to the pocket where I still, out of some old habit I had never fully broken since Georgia, keep a single smooth stone. I sat in my rental car afterward, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, the cicadas outside loud enough to feel almost physical against the closed windows, and I found myself reaching for a small, solvable worry to hold instead of the larger one sitting in my chest, wondering whether I had remembered to charge my camera battery for the next day's documentation, a thought entirely unrelated to what I had just done, standing alone at another person's shrine after dark, for reasons I could not fully account for even to myself. I do not know as I tell you this, whether I am simply doing my job with unusual thoroughness, or whether I am quietly, once again, building a private ritual of my own alongside someone else's, the way I once did in Georgia, the way Julian Santana Barrera did for 50 years, beside a girl whose very existence his own family has never been able to confirm. I have started keeping a private log of my own behavior at this site, a habit my therapist suggested when I called her, uncertain and unsettled, after that first evening walking the perimeter alone, and rereading it now, 6 weeks in. I can see a pattern accumulating that I do not fully like the shape of. Additional minutes spent the site beyond what documentation requires, a growing reluctance to leave before full dark, a private vocabulary already forming in my own notes that echoes, more closely than I am comfortable with, the language Desmond himself uses to describe his daughter's continued presence there. I read back through 3 weeks of those entries last night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I let go cold, exactly the way I always seem to these days, and I noticed, with a discomfort I have not fully processed yet, that the handwriting itself had grown noticeably smaller and more careful over those 3 weeks. The particular, controlled penmanship of someone recording something they suspect somewhere underneath the words they are not supposed to be admitting to at all. I have started to wonder whether the distance my profession is built around, the careful boundary between documenting a ritual and participating in it, was ever as stable as my training led me to believe, or whether it simply depends, every single time, on how close the ritual in front of me happens to land to whatever grief I am still quietly carrying myself, unresolved and unnamed, waiting for the first sufficiently similar shape to finally give it somewhere to go. I called my therapist again last night, later than our usual sessions, and she asked me the same question she has asked before, gently, without judgment, whether I thought I could finish this particular project the way I need to, or whether I needed to hand it to a colleague before it went the way Georgia once did. I told her I did not know yet. I am still not certain, sitting here telling you this, that I have found a more honest answer since. I still do this work, and I still believe, fundamentally in its value, that these sites deserve careful, respectful documentation before time and whether erase them entirely. I have simply stopped trusting my own professional distance as completely as I once did, and I have started asking myself, standing at the edge of Desmond Aldous' Bayou Memorial in the humid dark Exactly how many more anniversaries I intend to keep returning to sites like this one before I have to admit that I am not only documenting a 50-year ritual anymore, but quietly, carefully, beginning to build one of my own. I think some nights about Julian Santana Barrera, walking his island alone in the dark, adding one more doll to a tree already sagging under the weight of the last 500, certain each time that this next one would finally be enough. And I wonder how many years passed before he stopped being able to remember what enough had ever meant to him in the first place, or whether he had ever really known at all, or whether some rituals are simply never built to answer that question honestly.